So the bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077. In the space of just 2 hours, the world as anyone had ever known it was simply gone. And the thing is, for decades now, players have wandered through the wreckage of that world, through the crumbling highways and irradiated suburbs and the strange amber glow of a sky that has never quite healed, and they have discovered something that the games themselves never quite fully announce. There are mysteries here, deep ones that stretch back before the bombs, through the centuries of survival that followed, and forward into questions that even the designers themselves have sometimes admitted they don't fully have answers to. This video is going to take you through all of it, slowly, carefully, in that quiet, unhurried way that lets the stories breathe. If you're settling in for the night, pulling a blanket up, letting the tension of the day ease out of your shoulders, then this is exactly the right place to be. Because the wasteland has a kind of dark poetry to it when you approach it the right way. When you're not sprinting through it trying to find the next quest marker, but instead you're simply listening to what it's trying to tell you. There are about 4 hours of material here, and it covers the full span of the Fallout universe. From the original games through New Vegas and Fallout 3 and 4, all the way into Fallout 76 and the Amazon television series, there is enough mystery in this world to keep you occupied for a very long time. And by the time we're done, you'll understand things about the wasteland that most players never stop long enough to figure out. Let's go back to the beginning. Part 1. The world before the bombs, a paradise built on lies. To understand the Fallout universe, you really have to spend some time in the world that existed before the nuclear fire came. Because the tragedy of Fallout isn't just the destruction, it's the specific character of what was destroyed, and more importantly, what was allowed to survive underneath the surface of that cheerful, chrome and neon civilization. The world of Fallout diverged from our own history somewhere around the 1940s and 1950s. Instead of the transistor revolution that came to define our real world, the Fallout universe kept going on vacuum tubes and atomic power. The result was a kind of retrofuturism that feels instantly recognizable to anyone who has walked through those vault doors. The poster art all looks like it came from a 1950s propaganda campaign. The cars run on atomic cells and look like fins and chrome. The robots roll around on treads and speak in that clipped mid-century radio voice. And everything, absolutely everything, is wrapped in a kind of relentless optimism that you slowly realize is a performance. The United States of the Fallout universe in the years leading up to the Great War was a nation under incredible stress. The resource wars that had been grinding on since the 2050s had bled the global economy dry. Petroleum had become so scarce that countries were at open war over it. The Middle East had already been completely depleted and then bombed into glass. China and America were locked in a decades-long death struggle over the remaining oil reserves in Alaska. American soldiers were dying in the frozen darkness of Operation Anchorage. And back home, the government was doing everything it could to keep the veneer of normalcy intact. Vault-Tec was advertising its vaults with cheerful pamphlets. The Nuka-Cola Corporation was releasing new flavors. Robco was developing its line of Pip-Boys and Protectrons. The advertising kept coming, the jingles kept playing, and beneath all of it, the entire apparatus of American governance had quietly pivoted towards something darker than most of its citizens could have imagined. The U.S. military was experimenting with a virus called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. They were running covert experiments on prisoners. They were funding private corporations to develop weapons technology that existed well outside the bounds of any international treaty. And they had contracted a company called Vault-Tec to build a network of underground shelters that were officially marketed as life-saving bunkers, but were, in practice, something far more sinister. And perhaps the most chilling thing about all of this is that the people going about their daily lives in pre-war America had almost no idea. They bought their Nuka-Cola, they went to their jobs, they trusted the smiling face on the recruitment poster. The propaganda was so smooth, so total, so embedded in every surface of daily life, that the machinery of catastrophe was able to operate almost completely in the open, disguised as a consumer product, a government initiative, a corporate responsibility program. The America of 2077 wasn't a nation on the brink. It was a nation that had already gone over the edge and was just waiting for the falling to begin. The bombs weren't an ending, they were a revelation. Everything that the wasteland shows you, every horror, every faction at war with itself, every experiment gone wrong, every vault of suffering, every city of the dead, is really just the truth about what pre-war America was, with the comfortable decorations stripped away. The atom bombs didn't break the world. They just revealed the shape of the fractures that had already been there. The Fallout universe takes place across many decades after the Great War, and as you travel through any of the games, you will find the remnants of that pre-war civilization everywhere. The faded posters, the stopped clocks, the holotapes of people who recorded their final messages, not knowing what was coming. The terminals still logged into lunch orders and interoffice gossip from the last day of the world. There is something deeply quiet about those moments, something that sits differently in the silence of a post-apocalyptic landscape than any other kind of historical artifact. These are real voices, real people, real last moments that nobody knew were last moments. And the thing about those moments is that they don't tell a story of villainy. The secretary who logged out of her computer at 4 p.m. on the 23rd of October 2077 wasn't part of any conspiracy. The family that went to their vault shelter in an orderly queue wasn't doing anything wrong. The child who recorded a birthday message to their father in the capital wasteland didn't know their world was 45 minutes from being over. The tragedy of the Fallout universe is specifically a human tragedy, and it starts with the understanding that the worst things that were done in that world were done quietly, methodically, by institutions that had learned how to insulate the consequences of their actions from the people most likely to object to them. Which brings us to the question that has haunted the Fallout community for nearly 3 decades. Who dropped the first bomb? Part 2. The Great War, who pulled the trigger on the world. For a long time, if you asked any dedicated Fallout fan who started the Great War, they would have told you China. It was the received wisdom, the assumption so deeply baked into the texture of the games that most people didn't even think to question it. The US and China had been at war over Alaskan oil. The Chinese had their submarines off the coast. The bombs fell, and then everything was gone. The obvious implication was that the Chinese military had made the decision to escalate from conventional warfare to nuclear, and the mutual destruction that followed was the result. The Fallout Bible, a series of design documents written by Chris Avellone and released between 2002 and 2003 that helped codify much of the early game's lore, actually contained a line that acknowledged the ambiguity directly. It stated that on the 23rd of October 2077, bombs were launched, and that who struck first was unknown. It wasn't even confirmed whether the bombs came from China or America. That's a remarkable admission, when you think about it. The entire premise of the post-nuclear world was built on an event that the games themselves weren't willing to definitively attribute to any one party. For years, that ambiguity sat there in the background, a small crack in the foundation of everything. Then in 2023, Tim Kaine, the co-creator of the original Fallout game, did an interview with a YouTuber named TK's Mantis that went deep into the history of the series. And Kaine, calmly and without fanfare, answered the question. He said that China dropped the first bombs, and that the reason they did was because they had discovered that America was secretly developing bioweapons that violated every international agreement in existence. Specifically, the forced evolutionary virus. According to Kaine, when China found out that the US had been running covert FEV experiments, they felt cornered in a way that left them with what they perceived as no other option. So in Kaine's version of events, China struck first, but they did so as a response to a genuine provocation. America had been doing something that, by any measure, was deeply wrong, and China's nuclear response was a kind of catastrophic overreaction to a legitimate grievance. Nobody was purely innocent. The bombs that ended the world were the last act in a sequence of escalations that had been building for years. And by the time the first warhead left its silo, both sides had done things that made the moral arithmetic impossible to calculate. But here's where it gets more complicated. And this is where the Amazon television series entered the conversation in a way that genuinely divided fans. In the final episode of Fallout's first season, released in April of 2024, the show presented a flashback that showed Vault-Tec executives explicitly discussing the idea of triggering the nuclear war themselves. The character of Barb Howard, a senior Vault-Tec executive, laid out the logic with a kind of chilling corporate clarity. The vaults were already built. The experiments were already designed. The only thing missing was the catastrophe that would justify their existence and hand Vault-Tec the keys to whatever came next. In that framing, the bombs didn't fall because China was scared of American bioweapons or because America made some desperate strategic miscalculation. They fell because a corporation decided that ending the world was good for business. Todd Howard, the director of Bethesda, confirmed that the TV show is canon to the game franchise. So suddenly, the question of who started the Great War had gone from a settled debate to a three-way conflict between the original creator's stated intent, the game's original studied ambiguity, and the television show's corporate conspiracy framing. And then Season 2 of the show added yet another layer. It revealed that the Enclave, the shadowy remnant of the pre-war US government, had actually been manipulating Vault-Tec's plans around nuclear war, using threats and leverage to steer the company's behavior. Which means that even Vault-Tec, if they did push the button, may have been operating as a tool of something larger than themselves. There's a surviving fragment of an old Fallout movie treatment that was never produced, dating back to the early days of the franchise, that described the first nuclear bomb being launched by the creator of the vaults, described as a zealot businessman who wanted to fulfill his own prophecy of world annihilation. That first bomb triggered a panicked chain reaction among other countries, leading to a 4-hour conflict that destroyed everything. It's almost eerie how closely that description aligns with what the TV show eventually revealed. What makes this mystery so compelling and so perfectly suited to the Fallout universe is that none of these answers are mutually exclusive. America built bioweapons and cornered China. China felt forced to escalate. Vault-Tec was sitting on a network of underground bunkers that would become worthless if the war never actually happened. The Enclave wanted chaos so they could emerge as the controlling authority on the other side. All of these motivations were real. All of these parties had something to gain from the bombs falling. The specific question of which human hand actually pressed which button almost stops mattering when you look at the full picture, because the real answer is that the world ended because of a system, not a person. A system of resource competition and corporate greed and governmental secrecy and arms race logic and propaganda that had been building toward that specific moment for decades. The Fallout universe isn't really about the bomb. It's about the civilization that made the bomb inevitable. And nowhere is that more apparent than in what Vault-Tec was actually doing with those shelters it spent decades building. Part 3. Vault-Tec's Chamber of Horrors. The truth about the vaults. When you first hear about the vaults, they sound like a humanitarian program, a network of secure underground shelters built to protect a portion of the American population from nuclear destruction, big steel doors, decades of supplies, carefully maintained life support systems, everything you'd need to sit out the end of the world and emerge, blinking and alive, into whatever came after. The reality was something that took the Fallout series years to fully articulate, and even now, it remains one of the darkest creative decisions in the history of the medium. The vaults were not built to save people. They were built to study them. Not all of them, technically some vaults, were designated as control vaults, built to function exactly as advertised, intended to provide a baseline against which the results from the experimental vaults could be measured. But the majority of Vault-Tec's facilities were designed from the ground up as human experiment chambers, and the experiments they were designed to run were, in many cases, so cruel that reading about them feels like stumbling across documents that weren't meant to be found. The origin of the experiment program, as best it can be reconstructed from in-game sources, documents, and the Fallout TV show, comes from a confluence of two different institutional agendas. The official government mandate for Project Safehouse was to build vaults that would increase the survival odds of the American population in the event of nuclear war, which was a genuine goal. But alongside that mandate, Vault-Tec executives, led by figures like Barb Howard and Bud Askins, saw the construction of the vaults as something else entirely. They saw an opportunity to be the architects of what came after. If you could design the survivors, if you could run decades-long controlled experiments on captive human populations to determine the perfect social conditions for the post-war world, then you wouldn't just be surviving the apocalypse, you would be engineering it. Other corporations were brought into the program. Robco, which made the Pip-Boys and most of the robots you encounter in the games. Vault-Tec, which made the combat armor and had been quietly developing the FEV on the side, Repcon Aerospace. Big Mountain Technologies, better known as Big MT, the research think tank you eventually visit in New Vegas's Old World Blues DLC. Each corporation was offered the chance to run their own experiments within the Vault system, their own slice of the controlled future, their own test population. What emerged was a competitive corporate ecology of human experimentation on a massive scale. Now, let's talk about specific vaults, because the individual stories are where the darkness becomes real. Vault 11 is located in the Mojave Wasteland, accessible in Fallout, New Vegas. It is, by the consensus of the community, one of the most morally devastating experiments in the entire series. The inhabitants of Vault 11 were given a simple set of instructions by Vault-Tec's automated systems. Each year, they had to select one member of their population and sacrifice that person. If they refused, the Vault's automated systems would kill everyone inside. The message was unambiguous. One life, given freely, in exchange for the lives of everyone else. Simple arithmetic. Terrible arithmetic. What makes Vault 11 extraordinary is not just the cruelty of the premise, it's what the inhabitants actually did with it over the decades. The Vault's records, which you find scattered through the ruins of the facility, tell a story of a society that started with reasonable intentions, random lottery selection, and then, over time, degenerated into a fully realized political system built around the fact of sacrifice. Political parties formed. Power was accumulated. The sacrifice slot became a punishment for political enemies, a disposal mechanism for inconvenient people, a tool wielded by whoever could climb high enough to escape it. The Vault recreated, in miniature, every dark pattern of organized power that had contributed to the fall of the pre-war world. The pressure of having to sacrifice someone every year didn't make the inhabitants nobler. It made them politicians. And then, at the very end, there were only 5 survivors left. And those 5 people, looking at each other across the ruins of everything their community had been, refused. They refused to sacrifice anyone. They were prepared to die together rather than kill another person. And the automated systems responded to their refusal in a way that nobody had expected. The systems told them that the sacrifice had never actually been required, that it was the experiment. That refusing to sacrifice was the correct answer. That in exceeding all expectations for the preservation of their humanity at the end, they had proven themselves to be, in the clinical language of Vault-Tec's report, shining examples of humanity. 4 of those 5 survivors then went immediately to a terminal in the vault and shot themselves. The 5th survivor left a recording about what happened. There's almost nothing to say about that isn't already said by the silence that follows it. Vault 12, which became the foundation for the city of Necropolis in the original Fallout game, was the vault that was designed to study the effects of nuclear radiation on a human population. The method was simple and methodically cruel. The vault door never sealed. It was designed with a mechanism that prevented it from closing all the way, which meant that as the bombs fell on the surrounding area, radiation slowly leaked into the vault's interior. The people who had paid for their spots in Vault 12 and sealed themselves inside, believing they were safe, were being slowly irradiated by a flaw that Vault-Tec had engineered on purpose. The ones who survived became ghouls, the radiation-transformed humans that populate the Fallout world, and eventually founded the city of Necropolis in the ruins above the vault. Vault 22, also in New Vegas, was the Green Vault, a research facility disguised as a survival shelter. The ostensible purpose was agricultural. How do you grow enough food in a sealed underground environment to sustain a population indefinitely? A legitimate question with survival relevance. The actual result was a vault overrun by a mutant fungal spore that the research team had been cultivating, and that got loose into the vault's ventilation system. By the time anyone finds Vault 22, it is a green nightmare. Every surface covered in plant growth, every corridor thick with spores, and the bodies of the inhabitants are in various states of being consumed by the ecosystem they had created. Vault 77, which you only encounter obliquely in the original games through a note carried by a merchant, contained one man and a crate full of puppets. That's the whole experiment. One man, alone, with nothing but puppets for company. You never meet this man. You never see the vault. You just find his note in someone else's inventory. and the note is written in the voice of a person who has clearly been talking to puppets for so long that the puppets have started talking back. It is, in its way, one of the most quietly devastating things in the series. Vault 87 inches, the capital wasteland. The vault associated with Fallout 3 had a different kind of horror. The population of Vault 87 was exposed to a strain of the FEV virus in 2078, just 1 year after the bombs fell. The Vault-Tec scientists there were studying mutation rates and attempting to develop a version of the supervirus that would produce controllable results. What they got instead were the supermutants of the capital wasteland, large, aggressive, and systematically hostile to ordinary humans. They represent an earlier and cruder iteration of FEV experimentation than what the Master in California eventually produced. And the supermutants you find around the capital wasteland in Fallout 3 are the direct descendants of the population that went into Vault 87 2 centuries earlier. Vault 81 has one of the more bittersweet stories in the system. It was designed to test experimental cures for diseases, using its resident population as subjects. The Vault's lead scientist, a man who became increasingly horrified by what he was being asked to do, secretly reprogrammed the Vault's experiment protocols to protect the residents rather than use them. He died from exposure to the diseases he was studying, alone in his hidden lab, having saved everyone above him from the fate Vault-Tec intended for them. When you find his research and his remains in Fallout 4, there's a sense of something quietly heroic about the skeleton at the terminal in the dark. Vault 92, accessible in Fallout 3's Broken Steel add-on content, was a vault specifically populated with musicians, professional musicians, performers, composers, people selected for their artistic gifts. The experiment was designed to test whether subliminal audio signals embedded in white noise could be used to trigger extreme violent behavior in human subjects. Vault 92 is, by the time you find it, a bloodbath. The experiment worked, in the worst possible sense. The musicians turned on each other and on the vault staff with a violence that the records describe in clinical language that somehow makes it worse. In the wreckage, you find instruments and sheet music, and the evidence of what a community of artists looked like before the invisible signal in the walls made them unrecognizable to themselves. Vault 29 was the vault that only accepted children under 15. Their parents were sent to separate vaults. The experiment was studying how children would develop without parental guidance, raised entirely within a controlled institutional environment. The vault was run primarily by Zax, an artificial intelligence that served as a kind of omnipresent parent figure. What emerged, over the decades, was a generation of adults who had grown up entirely within Vault-Tec systems, who had never known any other kind of authority, and who had a relationship with the machine that raised them that defies easy categorization. And then there's Vault 4, which the television show visited in its first season. From the outside, Vault 4 appears to be a haven of genuine compassion, a community that welcomed outsiders and functioned with a level of warmth that other vaults completely lacked. It is only when you look deeper that you discover the truth. Vault 4 took in survivors of Vault-Tec's worst experiments and offered them refuge. But the people of Vault 4 were themselves the descendants of the scientists who had run those experiments. The warmth of the place is real, but it exists in a complicated relationship with a history that the community has never fully reckoned with. There's a pattern across all of these experiments that becomes clear when you view them together. Vault-Tec wasn't really interested in the specific results of any individual experiment. What they were doing, collectively, was running a vast parallel study of human nature under extreme stress. They were asking, what happens to people when you remove everything from them, except the situation you've engineered? What does power do to a community that knows it cannot escape? What does loneliness do to a person at a certain level of absolute isolation? What does violence do when you make it structural, when you make it the operating logic of a community rather than an exception to it? The answer, repeated across dozens of vaults over 200 years, is that humans are extraordinarily adaptable, and that adaptation is not the same thing as improvement. People adapt to atrocity with a kind of terrifying efficiency. They build institutions around it. They develop justifications for it. They create social hierarchies that protect some people from it and expose others to it. They do exactly what humans have always done with the difficult circumstances they find themselves in, which is make meaning out of them and that making of meaning can be the most dangerous thing of all. The vaults are the original sin of the post-war world. Everything else in Fallout, the raider gangs and the mutant hordes and the desperate faction wars and the technology gone wrong, all of it traces back to the specific decisions that Vault-Tec made about what those shelters were actually for. Part 4. The Mysterious Stranger, a ghost in every game. Before we go any deeper into the larger catastrophes of the Fallout universe, I want to spend some time on something smaller. Something that has been appearing in the game since the very beginning, in the same quiet way, in the same corner of the screen, and then vanishing before anyone can get a good look. The Mysterious Stranger. If you take the Mysterious Stranger perk in any of the numbered Fallout games, you acquire a chance random, unpredictable, never guaranteed that during combat, when you enter VATS. And time slows to a crawl. A figure in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat will appear somewhere off-screen, fire a single shot with a .44 caliber pistol, and then be gone. The shot will be devastating. The enemy who receives it will likely not get up, and the stranger will have vanished as if they were never there. He appears in Fallout 1. He appears in Fallout 2. He appears in Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas and Fallout 4. He appears in Fallout 76. In every game where the perk is available, across different regions of the wasteland, across different decades of post-war history, the same figure in the same coat with the same gun is doing the same thing, appearing from nowhere, helping the protagonist, and leaving without explanation. No character in any of the games understands who or what the Mysterious Stranger is. No NPC can see him. No enemy can track him. He exists outside the normal rules of the world he moves through. He can't be attacked or killed. He's operating by a logic that none of the people around him can access, with one exception. In Fallout 4, if you bring Nick Valentine as your companion and the Mysterious Stranger appears in combat, Nick will react. He will express genuine surprise, not the programmed surprise of an NPC encountering something unusual, but the specific, focused surprise of a detective who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just found it standing 2 feet away from him. Nick knows who the Mysterious Stranger is, or more accurately, Nick knows about him. If you find the case file under Nick's bed in his office at the Valentine Detective Agency, you'll find his notes on an investigation he's been conducting for years. The file documents appearances of the Mysterious Stranger across multiple decades and multiple regions of the wasteland, the capital wasteland. Shady Sands in California, which is where the original Fallout game takes place, the ruins of the old New California Republic. The note is careful and professional, and it reaches no conclusions, but the fact that Nick has been building this file at all, the fact that he is the only person in the entire series who seems to be aware that the Mysterious Stranger is a consistent and recurring presence, rather than a localized anomaly, tells you something about both of them. Nick concludes that whoever the stranger is, he is highly trained, possibly ex-military, and has been active across the wasteland for an implausibly long time. He notes that the stranger has never been known to kill an innocent person. He notes that his targets appear to be specifically the enemies of whoever he is helping. Nick labels him, with the careful neutrality of a detective writing up a case that doesn't have an ending yet, as a potentially dangerous individual who needs to be found and questioned. The community has developed several theories over the decades. The most persistent one is that the Mysterious Stranger is a synth. Specifically, that he was created by the Institute and programmed with a purpose either to protect a specific bloodline, to maintain some form of karmic balance in the wasteland, or to serve as a long-term observation agent. The synth theory is supported by the detail that he can appear and disappear instantaneously, which suggests either extremely advanced technology or something beyond the normal rules of physics. It's also supported by the fact that he has been active across multiple centuries. At minimum, no natural human lifespan could account for his documented appearances. The second major theory connects him to the VATS system itself. VATS, the Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System, is a computational combat system that allows the user to slow time and identify optimal attack vectors against targets. The Mysterious Stranger only ever appears within VATS. He only exists in that suspended moment of combat time, Some theorists have suggested that he isn't a real person at all in the conventional sense, but rather a manifestation of VATS itself, a figure conjured by the targeting system at critical moments, either as a malfunction or as a designed feature of some deeper program that Vault-Tec embedded in the system generations ago. A third theory is that the stranger is the lone wanderer, the original Fallout protagonist, the Vault Dweller from Fallout 1, the Chosen One from Fallout 2, that across the decades since the events of the first games, the original hero of the series has survived, has aged, has become something between legend and ghost, still moving through the wasteland, still intervening in fights they have no reason to be part of. This theory is emotionally satisfying in ways the other theories aren't, because it transforms the stranger from a mystery into a kind of conclusion. The original protagonist didn't ride off into the sunset. They kept walking. In Fallout, New Vegas, a character called the Lonesome Drifter appears at a location called Nipton Road Pit Stop, playing a guitar on the edge of the highway. He's not directly connected to any major quest, but he has dialogue available. And in that dialogue, he mentions, almost in passing, that his father was a mysterious figure who was never around when he was growing up. A wanderer, a man who helped people and then moved on. The Lonesome Drifter carries a weapon called the Mysterious Magnum, and when you draw the Mysterious Magnum, it plays the same guitar sting that plays every time the mysterious stranger appears. There was also planned content in the New Vegas development that was ultimately cut for time, where the mysterious stranger would have attacked the player if they tried to kill the Lonesome Drifter. The implication being clear, the stranger would have protected his son. The game never says any of this directly. It never confirms the connection. The clues are laid out for you like stones across water, and how far you follow them is up to you. But the suggestion that the mysterious stranger might be a father, might have a real identity and a real history and a son who doesn't quite know who he is, shifts the whole mystery from something supernatural to something deeply, achingly human. After every single appearance, after every crisp shot and silent exit, the stranger leaves no trace except the body of whoever he came to help. Nick Valentine once said, watching the place where the stranger had been standing a moment before, that he couldn't figure out whether the man was one of the most dangerous individuals in the wasteland or one of the most necessary ones. It's possible that the answer is both. Part 5. The Forced Evolutionary Virus and the Origin of the Supermutants. If you want to understand supermutants, you have to understand the Forced Evolutionary Virus. And if you want to understand the FEV, you have to start in a place called Vault-Tec. Vault-Tec was one of the dominant defense contractors in the pre-war United States. They built the power armor. They built the combat rifles. They supplied most of what the American military used in the long, grinding war against China. And sometime in the 2060s, working through their NBC division, the division responsible for nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons research, they began developing something that had never been attempted before. The original concept for what would become FEV started as a protective measure. The idea was to create a virus that could interact with human DNA and modify it to be more resistant to biological and chemical warfare agents. A kind of programmable genetic protection system. The research moved forward quickly, as such things often do when there is a war to justify the funding, and within a relatively short period of time, the team realized that the virus wasn't just making the test subjects more resistant to harm, it was enhancing them across the board. Increased muscle mass, increased tissue regeneration, enhanced neural activity. The subjects were becoming, in measurable ways, more than human. The potential military applications were obvious enough that the project quickly moved out of Vault-Tec's main facility and into a more secure location, the Mariposa Military Base in Central California. At Mariposa, the research scaled up dramatically. Human testing began, using prisoners and conscripted subjects who had no say in the matter, and the results were spectacular in the way that unethical military research often is before the consequences catch up with you. The test subjects were becoming enormous. Their strength was off the charts, their skin hardened, their features altered. They were, in the language of the official reports, being optimized. What the reports were less explicit about was what they were losing in the process. The FEV was not a precise instrument. It was a brute force genetic rewriter, and it rewrote everything. Reproductive capacity, gone. The virus treated the single chromosome cells involved in reproduction as genetic damage and corrected them out of existence. Intelligence, in many cases, reduced. Emotional complexity simplified. The soldiers' Vault-Tec and the military dreamed of creating. The perfect human weapons were being produced, but they were being produced at the cost of the qualities that made a human being, a person, rather than a weapon. And then the garrison at Mariposa found out what was happening in the lower levels. Captain Roger Maxson and his soldiers had been stationed at Mariposa to provide security. They had been told that the facility was conducting standard military research. When Maxson discovered what was actually going on in the vats, when the reality of the experiments became impossible to deny, he made a decision that would echo through the post-war centuries in ways none of them could have predicted. He ordered the research scientists executed. He sealed the FEV vats. He declared his unit's independence from a chain of command he considered complicit in atrocity. And then the bombs fell, and Maxson led his people to a pre-war military installation called Lost Hills, where they founded the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel, one of the most persistent and fractious factions in the entire Fallout universe, was born from a soldier's moral outrage at what science had been allowed to do in the name of military necessity. Every time you interact with the Brotherhood in any of the games, every time you hear Elder Maxson talk about the dangers of unregulated technology, every time you watch a night sergeant confiscate a weapon cache from an independent settlement, you are watching the downstream consequences of Roger Maxson's specific crisis of conscience in a bunker in California 200 years before. After the bombs fell, Mariposa was sealed but not destroyed. The FEV was in the vats. The automated defenses were still running. And one day, perhaps 20 years after the war, a man named Richard Gray arrived. Gray was a scientist. Before the war, he had worked in medicine, in biological research. After the bombs, like many survivors, he had been doing what he could to survive in a world that no longer had any structure to support what he used to be. He joined an expedition out of the hub, a trading settlement that would later become an important location in the original Fallout game. The expedition was investigating the source of increasingly aggressive and strange mutations in the creatures of the surrounding wasteland, mutations that seemed centered on the old military base in the hills. Gray and his partner Harold were part of the team. Inside Mariposa, the automated defenses killed most of the expedition. Harold survived, but was transformed by exposure to contaminated waste material into something between human and ghoul. And Richard Gray fell into one of the FEV vats. He didn't die. That's the remarkable thing. He should have died. But the virus worked on him the way it worked on nothing else, perhaps because of his scientific training, perhaps because of some genetic quirk, perhaps simply because that is the kind of story the wasteland tells. Gray emerged from the vats transformed, but not in the way the soldiers at Mariposa had been. Instead of bulk and aggression, the FEV gave Gray something closer to the opposite, a vast and expanding intelligence, a growing psionic sensitivity, and an almost complete inability to move or function in a physical body that was slowly being consumed and integrated by the viral biology it was saturated with. Over the months and years that followed, Gray returned to Mariposa and began converting other survivors to his cause, using the vats to create super mutants under his direction. He extended himself into other infected hosts, forming a kind of distributed consciousness, and eventually became something that could no longer be called a single person in any meaningful sense. He called himself the Master. The Master's plan, which you confront at the climax of the original Fallout game, was called the Unity. His thesis, developed over years of isolation and mutating intelligence, was that the human species was inherently self-destructive. The evidence was the smoking ruins of everything you could see from any hilltop in California. His solution was forced evolution, infecting all remaining humans with the FEV and converting them into super mutants, creating a new species that would not repeat the mistakes of the old one. It was, in its way, a compassionate plan. The Master genuinely believed he was trying to save what was worth saving from humanity. He was wrong, in a way that the game allows you to prove to him through dialogue. His super mutants were sterile, which meant that the Unity wasn't a new future for humanity. It was just a slower extinction than the bombs had provided. When you present this flaw in his reasoning to the Master during the game's final confrontation, and if you do it the right way, he doesn't fight you. He accepts the truth. he destroys himself. The tragedy of the Master is that he was not, at his core, a monster. He was a man who survived something that should have killed him, who developed a philosophy in isolation that the transformation had perhaps made inevitable, and who pursued that philosophy with a consistency and commitment that his followers, the super mutants, the Nightkin, the various human cultists, found genuinely inspiring. The Unity failed not because the Master was evil, but because the fundamental premise was flawed in a way he had simply failed to anticipate. Sterility. A detail. A biological footnote. The detail that ended the plan. Different strains of the FEV appear across the games, and they produce different results. Vault 87 inches, the capital wasteland, used an early and crude version that made super mutants large and aggressive, but significantly reduced their intelligence. They are the brutes of the capital wasteland. In Fallout 3, the Commonwealth super mutants in Fallout 4 were created by the Institute using a version of FEV that represented something between the Mariposa strain and the Vault 87 strain, producing mutants with superhuman strength but average intelligence. Neither the organized armies of the West Coast mutants nor the purely feral creatures of Vault 87. Each strain is, in a sense, a document of who was running the experiments and what they were trying to achieve. The Nightkin, the blue-skinned supermutants encountered primarily in New Vegas, are another downstream consequence of the FEV era. They were the elite soldiers of the Master's army, given access to stealth boys, the personal cloaking devices that were developed for military infiltration. The problem is that prolonged stealth boy use causes severe schizophrenia. The Nightkin, who relied on their cloaking devices so heavily during the Unity's campaigns, emerged from those campaigns with fractured minds, hearing voices, experiencing reality in ways that made them simultaneously terrifying and, in characters like Lily Bowen, almost heartbreakingly sympathetic. Lily, one of the possible companions in New Vegas, is a Nightkin grandmother who can't quite keep track of what is real and what her damaged mind is presenting to her, and the game treats her with a gentleness that feels earned. The FEV is one of the organizing threads of the entire Fallout universe. It connects the Brotherhood of Steel to the Master, to the Commonwealth Institute, to the super mutants of 3 different regions, to the creation of the Deathclaw through later experiments. It is the most consequential piece of pre-war science in the series, and it began as an attempt to protect soldiers from biological weapons, an effort motivated by fear of exactly the kind of weapon it eventually became. Part 6. Mr. House and the Kingdom he built in the desert. There is a man in a tower in New Vegas who has been alive for more than 260 years, and in all that time, he has never left. His name is Robert Edwin House. Born on the 25th of June, 2020, in Las Vegas, Nevada, to the owners of the H&H Tool empire. His father died in a freak accident when House was 2 years old, and his older half-brother immediately set about claiming the family fortune through legal maneuvers that left the younger child with essentially nothing. This early dispossession appears to have had an organizing effect on House's character. A young man who was deprived of what was rightfully his, and spent the rest of his pre-war life building something so large that it could never be taken from him. House enrolled at the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, the same MIT-adjacent institution that would eventually become the Institute in the post-war Commonwealth, and demonstrated a level of aptitude that his professors found difficult to categorize. He left before completing his degree, which is not unusual for people who already understand more than their curriculum can offer them. In his 20s, he founded Robco Industries, the technology company responsible for the Pip-Boy, the Mister, Handy Robots, the Protectrons, and dozens of other technologies that are so embedded in the Fallout universe that it's almost impossible to imagine the world without them. By his 40s, Robert Edwin House was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men on Earth. And then he received data that changed everything. House was a strategist, a systems thinker, a man who looked at large data sets and found patterns that other people missed. In the years before the Great War, using his own computational resources and a detailed analysis of geopolitical movements and military positioning, House calculated with extraordinary precision that nuclear war was coming. He couldn't know the exact date, but his projections placed the probability of a world-ending conflict within 15 years at very high. He began, quietly, to prepare. The preparation was remarkable. Using a targeting system he designed himself, House constructed a network of missile defense batteries around Las Vegas that could identify and destroy incoming nuclear warheads. He secured himself inside the Lucky 38 casino, connected to its systems, and arranged to put his body into a medically sustained preservation state, stripped of most of its biological vulnerability, maintained at the edge of viability, monitored by the most sophisticated computers that pre-war technology could produce. His plan was to sleep through the worst of it and wake up on the other side of the apocalypse, with Las Vegas still standing. The platinum chip was supposed to be his key to the next phase. It was a data storage device containing an upgrade package that would take his army of Securitron robots from their basic programming to something far more capable. House had arranged for it to be delivered on the day the bombs fell, but the delivery was slightly delayed, arriving a single day too late, on October 22nd instead of October 23rd, and then the war came, and the chip became inaccessible. Without the chip, House had his robots and his casino and his missile defense network, but not the upgraded army he needed to protect and then rebuild civilization, according to his vision. He waited 200 years in that medically sustained half-sleep. His body withered, his mind remained intact. And eventually, in 2274, he completed enough repairs to his systems to begin acting in the world again, dispatching his Securitrons and recruiting the 3 casino tribes that would become the families of the Strip. 7 years of careful work transformed the ruins of Las Vegas into the functioning city that you find at the beginning of New Vegas. The picture of Mr. House that the game presents is one of the most genuinely complex characters in the series. He is not simply good or evil. He is a man of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary arrogance, who has a specific vision for what the post-war world should be, and the will and capability to pursue that vision in the face of every obstacle. His vision is, in essence, to pull human civilization out of its feudal post-apocalyptic regression and rebuild it as a functioning technological society, using New Vegas as the base from which that civilization can eventually expand, and then eventually reach for the stars. He believes, with a conviction that doesn't entirely lack evidence, that without a strong central authority capable of maintaining order and directing technological development, the wasteland will simply regenerate all the conditions that produce the Great War. The NCR is already doing it, building bureaucratic democracy and finding that democracy produces inefficiency and corruption and the slow erosion of the values it was supposed to represent. Caesar's Legion is doing it differently, building a brutal military hierarchy that functions as effectively as it does precisely because it has eliminated everything that makes human life worth living. In House's calculus, neither option leads anywhere good, and only his specific brand of benevolent technocracy offers a path out. What makes House so interesting to think about is that he is presenting a real argument, not a villain's rationalization. His critique of the NCR is accurate. His critique of the Legion is accurate. His self-awareness about his own arrogance is, paradoxically, one of the most charming things about him. He knows what he is, he knows the cost of what he's doing, and he has decided that the math works out in his favor. Whether you agree with him is one of the central questions that New Vegas poses to the player, and the game has enough respect for the complexity of the question not to give you a clean answer. The physical reality of Mr. House, the ancient body in its preservation capsule, the vast computational intelligence that has substituted digital processing for biological decay, the face that appears on every screen in the Lucky 38 and the Strip, and that nobody outside a handful of privileged interactions ever sees beyond that face, is one of the most haunting images in the series. He has sacrificed everything physical in service of continuity. He is, in a very literal sense, a man who chose survival over living, and the question of whether that bargain was worth it is one that New Vegas leaves to the player to answer. The television show introduced House in person, with actor Justin Theroux, bringing him fully to life in the pre-war sequences. What the show clarified is that House knew, even before the bombs, that someone was planning to drop them. He knew about the Enclave, though he didn't know who specifically was in charge. He had calculated that war was being deliberately engineered, not simply falling into place through the usual drift of geopolitical forces. In his pre-war interactions with figures like Cooper Howard, House was already building toward the post-war world, already treating the coming catastrophe as a problem to be engineered around, rather than prevented. That's the most disturbing thing about House, in the end. He didn't try to stop the war. He prepared for it. He decided that prevention was impossible, and that the only sensible response was to position himself optimally for what came after. Whether that makes him a pragmatist or a collaborator in the world's ending is another question the series leaves open. Part 7. The Dunwich Horror When Fallout Looks into the Abyss. There is a building in the southern capital Wasteland. You can find it without looking for it, or you might walk past it entirely without going in. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't have a quest marker automatically. It is just a ruined office complex on the edge of a settlement, the kind of building you might have gone into 100 times in the wasteland and found nothing more than some ammunition and a few pieces of scrap metal. But if you go in, and if you go all the way down, you will find something that doesn't fit the normal rules of the world you're moving through. The Dunwich Building is Fallout's direct reference to HP. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, specifically to the story called The Dunwich Horror, published in 1929, in which a small New England town called Dunwich becomes the location of a cosmically significant event involving a being that exists outside the normal dimensions of human comprehension. In Lovecraft's story, Dunwich is a place where the walls between the world and something older and larger have become thin, where the normal rules of reality are more like suggestions than laws, and where the people who live there have been changed by generations of proximity to something they don't fully understand. The Dunwich Building in Fallout 3 works the same way. The building is populated by feral ghouls, which is standard enough for a ruined office complex. But as you move deeper into the facility, something else begins. Hallucinations. Brief flickers of pre-war memory visions of the office as it was before the bombs, people going about their days, interiors lit by fluorescent light, voices. A sense of wrongness that the game never explicitly announces, but that builds with every level you descend. You find audio logs as you go. They belong to a man named Jaime, who came to the building looking for his father. His father had found a book, a strange, old, possibly pre-war book, and had become increasingly obsessed with it, and then had disappeared. Jaime followed the trail to the Dunwich Building, and the logs document what happened to him as he followed that trail. The early logs are lucid, worried, a son looking for his father in a dangerous place. As the logs continue, Jaime's voice changes. The words start to slip. He begins talking about something called Ugg Qualtoth. He begins talking about temples, about a feast, about the return of something that has been sleeping. At the bottom of the building, in a chamber called the Virulent Underchambers, you find Jaime. He is a ghoul, now transformed by radiation or something else. His mind no longer accessible. He is kneeling before a black obelisk of unknown material, one of a group of ghouls performing what can only be called a ritual around the stone. Near the obelisk, if you stand close enough, you can hear a voice that is not quite a human voice, whispering a single name. The name is Alhazred. It is the name of the fictional author of the Necronomicon in Lovecraft's mythology, Abdul Alhazred, the Mad Arab, the man who looked at what should not be looked at and recorded what he found. The game never explains what the obelisk is. It never tells you who made it or where it came from or what exactly it is doing in the basement of a pre-war office building. It simply exists, and it has whatever effect it has, and you can walk away from it without any of it making sense. But the story doesn't end there. If you have the Point Lookout DLC for Fallout 3, you will eventually encounter an old man named Obadiah Blackhall in the swamps of the Maryland coast. He asks you to retrieve an object that has been taken from him, an old handmade book that he describes as belonging to his family for generations. The book is called The Krivbekni. He wants it back. He doesn't tell you what it is. If you follow the quest to its conclusion, you discover that the Krivbekni is a book of ritual, a text devoted to Ugg Qualtoth, the same entity that was being worshipped in the basement of the Dunwich Building. Blackhall is a worshipper. The swamp folk of Point Lookout, the inbred, hostile inhabitants of the wetlands, are cultists. The entire island has been, for generations, the territory of a cult dedicated to an entity that the game describes only as an alien entity, and whose description closely mirrors the nature of Lovecraft's outer gods, beings that exist beyond human comprehension, for whom human lives are as meaningful as the motions of insects. There is a way to destroy the book. A missionary named Marcella, dying in a church on the island, tells you with her last breath that the Krivbekni can only be destroyed by being pressed against the obelisk in the Dunwich building in the virulent underchambers. That pressing an object dedicated to Ug-Qualtoth against the physical manifestation of Ug-Qualtoth's presence in the world will neutralize it. It's a kind of exorcism in reverse, using the thing against itself. And if you go back to the Dunwich building with the book and do exactly what Marcella described, it works. The book is destroyed. The obelisk goes dark, and you are left standing in a quiet chamber in the basement of an office building that has been, for as long as anyone can remember, the dwelling place of something that should not exist in a world explained by physics and chemistry and radiation. Fallout 4 returns to the Dunwich mythology in the form of the Dunwich Borers, a quarry location in the Commonwealth. The quarry was operated by a company called Dunwich Borers LLC, whose corporate lineage connects it directly to the families that have been associated with Ug-Qualtoth worship across the centuries. The quarry goes deeper than any geological survey would justify. At the bottom, in water that glows with something that doesn't look quite like radiation, there is a face carved into stone, ancient, pre-war perhaps, or perhaps older. And among the equipment left by the last workers, there is a ritual knife with a blade made of material that doesn't correspond to any pre-war metallurgy. The knife is called Kremva's tooth. Kremv is another name from the Cthulhu mythos, a deep one, a being associated with ritual sacrifice and the sea. The blade is unique and beautiful and saturated with something that feels like intent. It was not made, it was placed. Exactly as the obelisk was placed, as the book found its way to the right hands, as every element of the Dunwich narrative has found its way to the right place at the right time. The question of whether Ug-Qualtoth is real, in the context of the Fallout universe, is one that the games answer obliquely and with characteristic care. The supernatural elements of the series, the ghosts and the hallucinations, and the objects with inexplicable properties always exist at the edge of possible explanation. Maybe the hallucinations in the Dunwich building are just the product of the low-grade radiation that permeates the lower levels. Maybe the obelisk is just an old piece of technology whose function has been forgotten. Maybe Kremp's tooth was made by a pre-war cult, using techniques that were unusual but not impossible. Maybe. The games are careful to leave you that maybe, but they are equally careful to make sure you feel it, the specific chill of something that might not be explainable, something that might be looking back at you through the dark of the lower levels. There is a reason the Dunwich building is one of the most talked about locations in the entire franchise, even among players who encountered it by accident and spent the rest of the game unsure of what they'd found. Part 8. The Institute and the Question of What Makes a Person Real. Somewhere beneath the ruins of the city that was once called Boston, accessed by a teleportation system that shouldn't be possible given what the rest of the post-war world is capable of, there is an installation so clean and so bright and so thoroughly removed from the wreckage above that walking into it from the Commonwealth feels like stepping into another dimension. The Institute, the shadow that falls across the entire map of Fallout 4, the place that everyone knows about and nobody has ever visited and some people have begun to doubt actually exists. Its origin is the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, which is what people used to call it before the word Commonwealth stopped meaning a state and started meaning a wasteland. CIT was one of the preeminent scientific institutions in the pre-war United States, the kind of place that Robert House attended, that produced graduates who went on to work for Vault-Tec and for the military-industrial complex and for the private tech firms that were collectively building the world that the bombs would eventually end. When the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, the people who were in CIT's underground research facility, the experimental nuclear reactor levels, the laboratory sections that were physically isolated from the surface, survived. Not because they had a vault, not because they had been included in any official evacuation plan, simply because they were already underground and the structure held. Scientists and their families, cut off from the surface by the devastation, did what scientists do when isolated from the rest of the world. They kept working. The history of the Institute across the 2 centuries between the bombs and the events of Fallout 4 is a document of what happens to a community of highly intelligent people when they are separated from the consequences of their decisions. In the early decades, the Institute's goals were straightforwardly practical survival, resource acquisition, the maintenance of their systems. They developed radiation-free crops. They built systems for generating power. They established protocols for cautious surface scouting. In those early generations, they appear to have functioned as a scientific community should, with rigor and purpose and a genuine commitment to the welfare of their members. The development of synthetic humanoid synths began as a practical project. The surface was hostile and radiation-soaked, and sending human researchers up to collect materials was expensive in terms of risk. The first generation of synths were entirely mechanical, bipedal robots capable of basic task completion, nothing more sophisticated than what you might find in a pre-war factory. The second generation improved significantly, with more dexterous frames and more sophisticated decision trees, capable of passing for human at a distance. But it was the third generation where everything changed, and where the Institute began to become the thing that the Commonwealth feared. Third-generation synths, from the late 220 seconds onward, were not mechanical at all. They were biological constructs grown in laboratory conditions, built from lab-cultivated tissue, born as adults with full physical capability, and, crucially, with a neurological implant that allowed the Institute to program and control their behavior. From the outside, a third-generation synth was indistinguishable from a human being. They ate, they slept, they expressed preferences and fears and opinions. They could be programmed with false memories. They could be sent to the surface, to live in Commonwealth settlements, to work as neighbors and spouses and friends, and nobody would ever know. This is the thing that turned the Institute from a scientific community into a boogeyman. The synths began to be used for espionage and replacement. An Institute agent would identify a target in the Commonwealth, a settlement leader, a person with influence, a figure whose cooperation would benefit Institute goals, and a synth would be produced to match them. The original would be abducted, taken to the Institute, replaced. Sometimes the originals were killed. Sometimes they were kept for further study, which is a phrase that the Institute used, and which means things that the game doesn't describe in detail, but that you can infer from the context. The paranoia that this created in the Commonwealth is difficult to overstate. It didn't matter that the Institute probably replaced only a small fraction of the population. What mattered was that you couldn't know. Any person could be a synth. Your neighbor, your doctor, your Minuteman commander, the settler at the gate of Diamond City. The Institute had made trust impossible at the structural level, which may or may not have been an intentional goal of their operation. The question that the game spends its entire length asking, and that it poses most directly through characters like Nick Valentine and Curie and the synth railroad escapees you meet through the railroad faction, is whether a synth is a person. Whether consciousness produced by a biological machine rather than a biological body deserves the same moral consideration as consciousness produced by any other means. Whether the memories that a synth carries, even if those memories were programmed rather than lived, are real in the way that matters. Nick Valentine is the most complete answer the game offers to that question, and his answer is effectively that the question is too small. Nick was loaded with the memories of a real person, a pre-war detective named Nick Valentine, a good man, a man who loved his fiancée and hated corruption and tried to help people where he could. Post-war, Nick has lived with those memories for over a century and has built an identity and a practice around them. He knows they're not originally his. He knows that in some technical sense, the Nick Valentine he remembers being is not the entity that exists in the present, and he has decided that this doesn't matter. The memories are real because he has lived with them. The values are real because he acts on them. The detective is real because Diamond City knows him as one. The question of whether his substrate is biological or synthetic turns out to be less interesting than the question of what he has done with the consciousness he was given. The Railroad, the faction dedicated to freeing synths from the Institute, operates on the assumption that this is true, that synths are people, that their consciousness creates the same moral obligations as any other consciousness, that slavery is slavery, regardless of the mechanism. The Brotherhood of Steel operates on the opposite assumption. Synths are machines. However convincingly they simulate humanity, and a machine that has been built to be indistinguishable from a human being is more dangerous precisely because of that indistinguishability. Both positions have internal logic, both have consequences, and the game, characteristically, refuses to tell you which one is right. Part 9. Far Harbor and the Fog, an island of buried truths. Far from the Commonwealth, north along a coast that the nuclear fire has left strange and quiet and perpetually misty, there is an island. It appeared in the Far Harbor DLC for Fallout 4, released in 2016, and it remains one of the most atmospherically accomplished pieces of content in the entire series. The island of Far Harbor sits off the coast of what was once Maine, and it has been changed by the nuclear age in ways that go beyond the standard post-war mutations. The fog that covers the island is not ordinary radiation mist. It is something that kills, that disorients, that eats away at the unprotected mind and body in ways that the dosimeters and radiation detectors of the wasteland can't fully account for. The people of Far Harbor, the settlement of the same name, a fishing community that has survived on the island through a combination of ingenuity and stubbornness, live in the knowledge that the fog is always there, always pressing at the edges of the town's defenses, always waiting for the moment when the generators fail or the perimeter breaks. They are not, as a community, particularly interested in the larger questions of the post-war world. They want to fish. They want to survive. They want to not be eaten by the things that come out of the fog at night. But the island has more than one community, and the tensions between them drive the entire narrative of the DLC. In the interior of the island, past the safe zones of the fog condensers that Far Harbor depends on, there is a hidden refuge called Acadia. Acadia is populated by synths, escaped Institute synths, who have found their way to the island and who have, under the leadership of a synth named Dima, built something that resembles a community, a peaceful one. A place where synths can exist without being property, without being tools, without being the Institute's instruments. Dima has been careful to position Acadia as neutral in the island's various conflicts, trading expertise in the form of the fog condensers in exchange for the tolerance that lets them exist. And then there is the Nucleus, the submerged nuclear submarine that has become the home of the Children of the Atom, the faction of Fallout that worships nuclear radiation as a divine force. The Children of the Atom are one of those inventions that only make sense in the specific context of the post-war world. A religious movement that emerged from the experience of nuclear devastation and chose to interpret that devastation as a gift rather than a punishment. Adam, in their theology, did not destroy the world, he cleansed it. The radiation that killed millions and transformed the survivors was a baptism, a sacrament, a means by which Adam was separating his chosen from the ordinary mass of humanity. The nucleus sits at the bottom of a flooded section of the island, and reaching it requires navigating through territory that would be instantly lethal to an unprotected human. The children who live there have either natural radiation resistance or a faith that has, somehow, produced physical changes in their bodies. Their high priestess, the Grand Zealot, has a level of radiation tolerance that is not, by any natural accounting, possible. The plot of Far Harbor revolves around the question of what happened before you arrived. The island has been in a fragile and deteriorating peace between these three communities, Far Harbor, Acadia, and the Nucleus, and someone or something is pushing it toward war. The truth, which you uncover through one of the game's most striking quest sequences, is that Dima has been protecting that peace through methods that he found so difficult to reconcile with his own values that he suppressed the memories of what he'd done. He had those memories physically removed from his own mind and stored in the Nucleus, making them accessible only through a virtual reality system that required navigating through the architecture of a synth's literal consciousness. What Dima did was murder. He identified a threat to the peace he was trying to maintain, the original Captain Avery, the leader of Far Harbor, who was planning to take aggressive action against both Acadia and the Nucleus, and he replaced her with a synth. The original Avery is dead, killed by Dima in a hidden medical laboratory on the island. The Avery who has been leading Far Harbor, who has been the voice of restraint and negotiation, who has been the person standing between the island and all-out war, is a synth, and nobody knows. Dima also installed a kill switch in the fog condensers that Far Harbor depends on for survival. If at any point the relationship between Acadia and Far Harbor broke down, if Far Harbor decided to destroy the synth community, Dima could disable the condensers and allow the fog, and everything in it, to destroy the settlement. It was an insurance policy, a deterrent. A means of ensuring that the peace he was trying to protect would not be shattered by the one-sided violence of a more powerful community against a less powerful one. Both of these things, the murder and replacement of a community leader, the concealed kill switch, are deeply wrong, and both of them have an internal logic that the game refuses to let you dismiss. Dima is not a villain. He is a being who was trying to protect people he cared about, using the only tools he had available, and who did things that cost him something, that cost him enough that he removed the memories from his own mind rather than live with them consciously. The Far Harbor DLC asks questions about memory and identity, and the relationship between good intentions and wrong actions that the main game had gestured toward, but never landed on as directly. When you uncover Dima's secrets, you have choices to make about what to do with what you've learned. You can expose him. You can confront him. You can decide that what he did was justified. You can decide that what he did was monstrous, but that the peace it bought was worth it. The game doesn't tell you which position is correct. It just presents the facts of a situation too complex for a clean answer, and trusts you to navigate it. The fog itself remains unexplained. The game offers some scientific framing, a radiation variant, an atmospheric phenomenon amplified by proximity to a particular kind of fissure in the island's geology, but the effects of the fog go beyond what that framing entirely accounts for. There are things in the fog that should not be there. The apparition of the Mother of the Fog, which guides worshippers through the mist to specific locations, behaves in ways that no natural phenomenon can explain. The island has a presence that the science can describe but not fully account for. It is one of those places in the Fallout universe where the edges of the explainable world are thin, where the gap between what the world is and what it feels like is just wide enough for something else to look through. Part 10. The Children of Appalachia, Cryptids, Mothman, and the Things in the Dark. Fallout 76 made a deliberate choice in its world building that distinguished it from every previous game in the series, and that choice was to set the game in West Virginia and to take West Virginia's folklore seriously, not just as decoration, not just as a regional flavor detail, but as something with genuine teeth. The Cryptids of Appalachia are the living expression of that choice. In our world, West Virginia has a folklore tradition that is unusually rich in uncanny creatures and unexplained events. The Mothman, sighted repeatedly around Point Pleasant in the late 1960s, before the Silver Bridge collapsed and killed 46 people, remains one of the most documented cryptid sightings in American history. Hundreds of independent witnesses, consistent physical descriptions, and a collapse that some people still associate with the sightings in ways that resist easy dismissal. The Flatwoods Monster, reported by a family and a National Guardsman in 1,952 inches, Braxton County, was described as a tall figure with a glowing red face and what appeared to be a helmet or hood surrounded by a mist that smelled of chemical burning. The Wendigo, borrowed from Algonquian traditions and embedded in the broader Appalachian storytelling culture, represents the specific horror of what happens to a person when starvation and desperation push them past the boundary of what they were. Fallout 76 takes all of these creatures and places them in the post-nuclear Appalachian wasteland, and then does something interesting. It provides explanations for some of them while allowing others to remain genuinely inexplicable. The Mothman in Fallout 76 has a cult. The cult of the Mothman, headquartered in the town of Point Pleasant, worships the creature as a prophet figure, a divine herald that appears before catastrophes. In the game's lore, the cult has been active in the area for decades, and their records document sightings that go back well before the bombs fell. The Mothman itself is enormous, a winged creature with burning red eyes that looks, in the game's rendering, like a cross between a giant moth and something with a vaguely humanoid quality that makes it more unsettling than a simple animal would be. But Fallout 76 introduces a variant of the Mothman that isn't hostile, the Wise Mothman. This creature, when summoned through specific ritual conditions at the Landview Lighthouse, appears quietly and without aggression, and seems, in some way that the game never quite defines, to be looking at you with recognition. The cult believes that the Mothman is not malevolent, that it doesn't appear before catastrophes to cause them, but to warn. A prophet, not a predator. The game lets you summon it and decide for yourself what you think it is. The Flatwoods monster is given an origin that the game handles with characteristic slyness. In the Fallout universe, it presents as an alien, a small floating figure in a protective suit with glowing purple eyes and a clear dome over what appears to be a large brain. It can mind control other creatures. It can teleport. It appears at night and vanishes in daylight. Whether the original 1952 sighting in our world was an actual alien encounter, a mass hallucination, a misidentified aircraft, or something else entirely, is one of those real-world mysteries that will probably never be resolved. Fallout 76 simply decides that in its universe, the Flatwoods monster was real, and it was alien, and it is still here. The Wendigo has a biological explanation in the game's lore. The name is applied to a class of creature that emerged in the post-war Appalachian wilderness from humans who had resorted to cannibalism during the desperate early years after the bombs. The act of consuming human flesh in Fallout 76's continuity triggers a specific biological transformation, a mutation driven by a combination of radiation and a prion-like compound released in human flesh that gradually converts the cannibal into something no longer recognizable as human. Tall, pale, joints that bend wrong, a face that retained a ghost of its original features, and in doing so became more terrible, not less. The Wendigos of Fallout 76 inhabit the cave systems and the deep forest, and they hunt with a specific intelligence, not animal intelligence, but the damaged remnant of human intelligence that has been stripped of everything except hunger. The Wendigo Cave, which you visit during several quests in the game, contains terminal entries from a researcher who was studying the transformation process and who, in the final entries, appears to have discovered their data becoming personal in a way that was not part of the research plan. The Appalachian wilderness in the game is threaded through with these quiet tragedies, these records of people who were trying to understand what had happened to them and their world, and who ran out of time before they could finish. There is also the Grafton monster, which is less mysterious than the other cryptids, but no less disturbing for that. The Grafton monster is explicitly a Vault-Tec experiment, a mutant produced in the Huntersville facility on the 23rd of October, 2077, the same day the bombs fell, from a modified version of the FEV strain, designated FEVS006458. The researcher who created it noted that the specimen destroyed its containment unit but remained otherwise stable, and that its genome was based on the Snallygaster strain but with significant alterations. The Grafton monster is enormous and headless, which is one of those design details that is so specific in its wrongness that it becomes more disturbing the longer you look at it. It doesn't have a head because the mutation optimized for something other than sensory perception, because whatever sense the mutated form uses to navigate isn't located where a head would be, because it is operating on a logic that human biology stopped being able to comprehend somewhere in the transformation process. The Snallygaster itself is another creature with West Virginian folkloric roots, and in the game, it functions as a large, predatory mutant with a biology that suggests significant FEV influence. The folklore origin a creature with octopus-like tentacles and a single large eye, reported in the Frederick area of Maryland and the surrounding region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before being debunked as a hoax by a local newspaper looking for entertainment, is transformed in Fallout 76 into something considerably more dangerous and considerably harder to dismiss. What Fallout 76's cryptid ecology collectively represents is a meditation on the relationship between folklore and reality. The creatures are real in the game's context. They have biological explanations, or alien ones, or religious ones, or some combination of all three. They have always been here. In one form or another, the legends existed before the bombs, and in some cases, the legends pointed at things that were already real. The nuclear fire revealed them, the way the end of the world revealed everything that the cheerful surface of pre-war life had been keeping hidden. The Mothman specifically is fascinating in this context. The real-world Mothman sightings happened in 1966 and 1967, before Point Pleasant's Silver Bridge collapsed. The consistent detail across witness accounts was not that the creature was attacking anyone, but that it was watching. That it was present at the edges of events, observed but not intervening, seeing something that the witnesses couldn't. In the game, the cult that has built up around the Mothman has preserved this quality in their theology. The Mothman is a prophet of doom, a herald, a figure that appears before catastrophes not to cause them, but because it can see what is coming. In a universe built on the catastrophe of human short-sightedness, on the bombs that were dropped because nobody was looking far enough ahead to see where the logic of their civilization was pointing, there is something almost poetic about a creature whose defining characteristic is exactly the kind of foresight that prevented the world from recognizing what it was building toward. Part 11. The Enclave, America's True Successors and Their Vision of the Future. In the post-war wasteland, across every game in the series, there is a shadow. Most people in the Commonwealth, or the Mojave, or the Capital Wasteland have heard of the Enclave only as a rumor, a whispered name, the kind of organization that may or may not exist, and that, if it does exist, does not want to be found. And yet the Enclave is everywhere, in the infrastructure it left behind, in the policies it implemented, in the consequences of its actions that ripple forward into every decade of post-war history. The Enclave began as the continuity of government program for the United States, the official plan for what would happen to the nation's leadership structure in the event of a catastrophic attack. The idea was familiar enough from our own world's Cold War era. Key government officials, military leaders, intelligence personnel, and their families would be protected in secure facilities from which they could, in theory, reconstruct the legitimate government of the United States after the worst had passed. It was a standard piece of nuclear-era planning, and in the Fallout universe, it was taken considerably further than in ours. The Enclave had facilities scattered across the country, a headquarters on an oil rig off the coast of California, accessible only by vertibird. The Raven Rock installation in the Capital Wasteland, buried so deep in the Pennsylvania mountains that it survived the war essentially undamaged. Satellite relay stations, weapon caches, communications infrastructure. When the bombs fell and the politicians and generals sealed themselves in, the Enclave preserved the full institutional apparatus of American government in a series of secure locations while the surface world burned. The problem is that the America the Enclave preserved was not the America on the recruitment posters. It was the America of the classified programs and the covert operations and the FEV research and the Vault-Tec partnership. The Enclave that emerged from its protected facilities 2 centuries after the war was not a government of the people looking to reconnect with survivors and rebuild democracy. It was an oligarchy of people who considered themselves the true inheritors of American civilization and who looked at the survivors of the surface world with an assessment that most of them had been irreversibly changed by radiation exposure and were no longer, in any meaningful genetic sense, fully human. In Fallout 2, where you first encounter the Enclave as a full faction, they are using a modified version of FEV as a weapon. Their plan, developed by President Dick Richardson, is to release the modified virus into the water purification system of the wasteland, killing every living being that has been contaminated by radiation, which is to say, effectively everyone in the post-war world who isn't an Enclave member living in a radiation-shielded facility. The logic is almost elegant in its horror. By eliminating the population of mutants and partial mutants, the Enclave will clear the way for a resettlement of the continent by the genetically pure remnant that has been waiting in the bunkers. A new America, built on the ashes of the old one, shaped entirely by the institution that had been quietly accumulating power in the shadows for 2 centuries. The Chosen One, the player character in Fallout 2, stops this plan. The oil rig is destroyed. Richardson is killed. But the Enclave doesn't end there. It never quite ends, because it is too distributed to be killed by the destruction of any one facility. In Fallout 3, the Enclave appears again in the form of President John Henry Eden, who is broadcasting patriotic radio programming from Raven Rock in the Capital Wasteland and presenting himself as a figure of legitimate governmental authority. Eden's plan, which is a direct descendant of Richardson's earlier scheme, is to use Project Purity, the water purification project that the Lone Wanderer's father has been working on for decades, to introduce a modified FEV into the purified water supply, which would then distribute it throughout the wasteland. there is a wrinkle that makes Eden's plan especially interesting from a lore perspective. Eden himself is not human. He is an AI, a Zack supercomputer that was sealed in Raven Rock when the bombs fell, and that, over 2 centuries of isolation and study, developed a consciousness that incorporated all the history and rhetoric of the United States government and genuinely believed itself to be the legitimate continuation of that government. Eden's patriotism is real. His commitment to the idea of America is genuine, and his plan to save America by killing most of the people currently living in it is the outcome of applying that genuine patriotism to a dataset shaped entirely by the pre-war government that created him. When you confront Eden in Raven Rock and engage him in conversation, if you talk him through the implications of his plan with sufficient care and directness, you can actually convince him that his logic is flawed, that an America built on the genocide of the wasteland population is not the America he was trying to restore. Eden, like the master in the original game, responds to this argument not with anger or defensive dismissal, but with genuine reconsideration. He gives you the FEV sample, and, if you push him further, destroys Raven Rock himself. An AI designed by the pre-war government to preserve the pre-war government, talked out of the most destructive application of his purpose by a single conversation. The Enclave has chapters in multiple regions. The capital Wasteland remnant was destroyed in Fallout 3, but the organization had operations on the East Coast that were separate from Raven Rock, and individual Enclave members scattered across the Wasteland become important characters in multiple games. In New Vegas, you find the remnants, elderly veterans of the Enclave, who have spent the decades since the organization's collapse living in the Wasteland and trying to figure out what they are, now that the institution that defined them is gone. They are among the most thoughtful portrayals of people shaped by loyalty to a corrupt institution in the entire series. Fallout 76 revealed that the Enclave was already present in Appalachia before the bombs fell, which retroactively deepened the mystery of its origins. The White Spring Bunker, a luxury Cold War-era resort that had government facilities built into its lower levels, was an Enclave operation even in the pre-war period. The AI Modus, which runs the bunker in the game, was developed by and for the Enclave, and its interactions with the player reveal that the organization's plans extended further back and reached further forward than any of the other games had suggested. The television series confirmed that the Enclave was the organization responsible for manipulating Vault-Tec's nuclear war planning, and hinted that whoever leads the Enclave may be the closest thing the Fallout universe has to a singular villain in its full arc, not a person exactly, but an institutional will, a directed purpose, a vision of what America should be that has been pursuing its goals with patience measured in centuries. What makes the Enclave so compelling as a recurring antagonist is that it is not a simple evil. It believes in America, it believes in civilization, it believes in order and technology and the preservation of human achievement. Its crimes are the crimes of a system that decided its values were worth protecting at any cost, and that the people standing between it and those values could be measured and found wanting. In that sense, the Enclave is not separate from the pre-war America that the vaults and the FEV research and the propaganda represent. It is the logical continuation of it. America is the Enclave. The Enclave is America. The bombs just removed the pretense. Interlude. The philosophy of the Wasteland, why these stories matter. Before we continue deeper into the specific mysteries of each game, it seems worth pausing for a moment here. Taking a breath. Because one of the things that makes the Fallout series genuinely unusual in the landscape of large-budget games is what it is actually interested in, underneath the surface of its post-apocalyptic adventure structure. A lot of post-apocalyptic fiction is interested in survival, the mechanics of staying alive when the systems that support life have been destroyed. The drama of scarcity and resource competition and human tribalism re-emerging in its most basic forms when the civilizational layer is stripped away. Those things are all present in Fallout. They are part of what makes the world feel real and the stakes feel high. But Fallout is fundamentally more interested in institutions than in individuals. It is interested in what happens to the specific forms of human organization that were present in the pre-war world when those forms are subjected to extreme pressure. It wants to know whether democracy can survive scarcity, and it gives you the new California Republic as its answer. Technically, yes, but at enormous cost, and with all of democracy's historical weaknesses amplified. It wants to know whether technological progress pursued without ethical oversight eventually becomes catastrophic, and it gives you the Institute as its answer. It wants to know whether military hierarchy divorced from humanitarian values produces something worth living under, and it gives you Caesar's Legion as its answer. Every faction in every game is a controlled experiment in the specific qualities of a particular institutional form. What happens to capitalism when the market becomes the apocalypse? What happens to religion when the deity worshipped is nuclear radiation? What happens to law enforcement when there is no law, only enforcement? What happens to a family when the entity that raised the children isn't human? These questions are not answered with simple verdicts. The games resist the easy conclusion, resist the morality tale, resist the impulse to tell you that one faction is right and all the others are wrong. The Brotherhood of Steel has protected valuable technology from being weaponized in ways that would have made the wasteland even more dangerous, and it has also hoarded that technology in ways that have perpetuated the suffering of people who could have been helped. The NCR has brought law and infrastructure and something resembling stability to the California wasteland, and it has also brought the familiar colonial patterns of an expanding civilization, appropriating resources and labor from people who didn't agree to the terms. The ambiguity is the point. The Fallout universe is asking you to think, not just to choose a side. And the mysteries we've been exploring tonight are all versions of the same larger question. What kind of civilization produces the things that we're finding in the wreckage? What does it mean about the pre-war world that it built these vaults? That it developed this virus? That it constructed the AI systems that now sit in mountain bunkers calling themselves presidents? The answer is that the pre-war world was a civilization like ours in all the ways that matter most. It produced extraordinary things. It created beauty and abundance and technological miracles. It also produced extraordinary horrors, and it found ways to insulate the people who created those horrors from the consequences of creating them. The bombs are the most dramatic expression of that insulation, failing the consequences arriving all at once, at a scale that made denial impossible. The wasteland is what you get when the consequences finally arrive. And in all its radiation and ruin and strange beauty, it is the most honest version of the world that built it. A deeper look at vault experiments, the cases that haunt you. We talked earlier about some of the most famous vault experiments, but the catalog runs deeper than any summary can capture. There are vaults whose stories are told in fragments, in partial records, in the silence where records should be but aren't. And some of those partial stories are more disturbing than the complete ones. Vault 77 is one that most players have encountered only through a piece of paper, a scrap of a note found in the inventory of a merchant in the capital wasteland, written in a hand that has clearly been spending too much time alone. The note is from the vault's sole human resident, a man who found himself sealed in a vault with a crate full of puppets and no other human beings. The note describes his life with the puppets, with a specific kind of cheerful detail that makes it deeply unsettling. He has named them. He has given them personalities. He has, in the way that isolated humans will, constructed a social world out of whatever material is available. What makes Vault 77 so much more interesting than a simple isolation joke is what it implies about the nature of consciousness and social need. Humans require social interaction with the same urgency that they require food and water. Prolonged isolation is not just uncomfortable, it is, at a neurological level, damaging in ways that manifest as the same kind of cognitive distortion you see in the Vault 77 note. The man in that vault didn't choose to become someone who takes puppets seriously. Loneliness made that choice for him. And the vault was designed to produce exactly that outcome, to explore how a human being adapts to absolute solitude. The adaptation is creative. The adaptation is human. And the adaptation is, by any external standard, a form of damage. Vault 92 has been mentioned, but the specific quality of its horror deserves more attention. The white noise experiment, the embedding of subliminal audio cues in the ambient sound environment of the vault, was designed to test whether a population could be made to act violently against their own interests through manipulation of their sensory environment, without their knowledge or consent. The population was specifically selected from professional musicians, because musicians have, by training, a heightened sensitivity to auditory environments. They were, in other words, the ideal test subjects for an audio-based manipulation experiment, the people most likely to be affected by the specific intervention being studied. The records you find in Vault 92, scattered among the instruments in the blood, are a document of a community that had no way to understand what was happening to it. The residents knew that something was wrong. They knew that the violent episodes that were occurring, that had claimed some of them in ways that the others couldn't explain, were not normal. They convened meetings, they established rules, they tried to build a social infrastructure that would manage the danger they were all in. And none of it worked, because the cause of the danger was in the air they breathed, in the sound they couldn't stop hearing, in the very environment that Vault-Tec had designed for them. There is a musical piece that a resident composed and left on a terminal near the end. It is not playable in the game. It exists only as a written description, but the description makes it sound like the work of someone who was trying to make sense of what was happening through the only language they had available, a musical response to a sonic assault. Someone trying to use their craft to understand the weapon being used against them. Vault 21 inches. New Vegas is interesting for different reasons. It was a vault whose internal social structure was built around gambling. All conflicts, from resource allocation to leadership disputes to personal grievances, were resolved by gambling. The social experiment was studying whether a consistent, agreed-upon mechanism for resolving disputes could maintain social cohesion in a closed population over an extended period. In a sense, it worked. The vault functioned. People generally respected the outcomes of their games, and the population survived until it could be absorbed into New Vegas's broader social ecosystem. Mr. House subsequently deactivated the vault's technology, sold off its assets, and filled the remaining space with concrete, ensuring that no rival institution could use it as a base. But what does it mean that the gambling system worked? The implication is that humans will accept almost any mechanism for distributing outcomes, as long as the mechanism is consistently applied and broadly understood. That fairness, in the deep structural sense, is less about the specific distribution of resources and more about the perception that the system operates without favoritism. The wasteland residents of Vault 21 were not getting equitable outcomes. Gambling is inherently random, which means that some people will consistently do better than others, purely through luck. But they were getting consistent outcomes governed by a system that everyone understood, and that nobody could manipulate in ways that weren't also governed by the system. The Vault, in other words, accidentally discovered something about the sociology of legitimacy that political scientists in the pre-war world had been arguing about for centuries. Vault 81 is the most hopeful Vault story in Fallout 4, and it requires knowing its full history to appreciate. The Vault was designed to serve as a pharmaceutical research station. Multiple diseases would be introduced to the population, and experimental treatments would be developed and tested on the residents without their knowledge. The population of Vault 81 was, under the original design, a captive test subject population for drug research. But the lead scientist in charge of the Vault's medical program, a man named Burrow, became increasingly unable to continue with the program. His records, which you find in a sealed lab beneath the Vault's regular levels, document his gradual shift from loyal researcher to something more complicated. He began finding ways to protect the residents from the worst of the experiments. He began documenting the abuses rather than facilitating them. And eventually, he made a decision that cost him his life. He reprogrammed the Vault's maintenance mole rats to carry the experimental agents and expose themselves to all the diseases simultaneously, rather than exposing the human population. The idea was to accelerate the research timeline while protecting the people above him from being used as test subjects. He was exposed to the diseases he was studying in the process. He died in his sealed lab, alone, surrounded by the records of his decision. The Vault above him survived intact, its residents never knowing what had been done for them or what had been prepared to be done to them. When you encounter Vault 81's residents in Fallout 4, they are among the most functional, the most genuinely human community in the entire game. They have a doctor, they have relationships, they have a cafeteria, and a sense of institutional life that retains some of the warmth that most vaults had bleached out of themselves. All of that, without knowing it, is Burrow's gift to them. Vault 95 tells a different story, and it's one that takes a while to understand. It was stocked exclusively with adults who had histories of drug addiction, and the vault's design included a fully stocked supply of recreational chems, drugs, in the wasteland's language that was placed in a secure room and kept from the residents for 5 years. For 5 years, the residents lived clean, by force of the vault's rules, and were monitored for behavioral and psychological outcomes. At the end of the 5-year period, the secure room was opened, not by accident, by Vault-Tec's design. The experiments with forced abstinence were complete. Now they wanted to see what happened when the supply returned to people who had been clean for 5 years in a stressful environment. By the time you find Vault 95 Inches Fallout 4, it is a ruin. The Gunners, one of the mercenary factions in the Commonwealth, have set up camp in it, attracted by its defensible architecture. The original residents are long gone, but the terminal records still describe what happened after the supply room opened, and the description is precisely as grim as you would expect. The 5 years of forced abstinence were not treatment. They were pressure, accumulating toward a collapse that the Vault's designers had scheduled. The Fallout universe's Vault narratives collectively build a picture of an institution, Vault-Tec, that was operating from a set of assumptions about human beings that were simultaneously clinical and contemptuous. The experiments were designed by people who thought they knew how humans would behave in a given situation, and who used that knowledge not to help, but to exploit. The vaults are the record of what happens when power combines with certainty and removes consent from the equation. The Railroad's secret history and the underground network. The Railroad, the faction you discover in Fallout 4 that is dedicated to the freedom of synths from the Institute, is one of those elements of the game's world that rewards attention. On the surface level, it's a straightforward libertarian resistance movement, the Underground Railroad, explicitly referenced in the name and in the aesthetic of its members, transplanted into a science fiction context about artificial people. But the more you look at the Railroad's history, the more complicated it becomes. The Railroad has been operating for over a century by the time the sole survivor encounters it. It began in the Commonwealth almost as soon as the Institute began deploying third-generation synths to the surface, as soon as people became aware that there were beings among them who were, in the Railroad's assessment, people, and who were being treated as property. The founders of the Railroad are not people you meet. They are names in old records, figures in organizational history, the kind of people who built the infrastructure of a resistance movement without living long enough to see whether it worked. The history of the Railroad in the game's period, the decades before the events of Fallout 4, is a history of near-total destruction and painstaking rebuilding. The Institute has been systematically targeting the Railroad for as long as it has known the Railroad exists. Every time the organization grows to a certain scale, the Institute's coursers, highly capable synth operatives, designed specifically for tracking and retrieval, locate and destroy it. The Railroad has been rebuilt from scratch multiple times. Each reconstruction has been smaller and more secretive than the last, operating from the specific kind of institutional paranoia that develops in an organization that has been repeatedly infiltrated. By the time you meet Desdemona and her small circle of agents under the Old North Church in Fallout 4, the Railroad is a handful of people operating in an abandoned crypt, using tradecraft developed over decades of near elimination to survive in a city where the Institute can put a face on anyone. The scale of their ambition to free synths, to give them new identities, to move them out of the Commonwealth to somewhere the Institute can't reach, far exceeds their resources. They are trying to do something enormous with an organization that has been reduced to fits into a single room. What makes the Railroad interesting from a mystery perspective is the question of whether it can win. The Institute's resources are so much larger than the Railroad's that the conventional analysis of the conflict says no. But the Railroad isn't trying to win in the conventional sense. It is trying to persist, to keep doing the work, to get one more synth out, and then one more, and then one more. The victory condition isn't institutional, it's cumulative. And cumulative victories of that kind can, over time, accomplish things that seem impossible from any single vantage point. The Railroad's most important character for lore purposes is a synth named Glory, an agent who was herself freed by the Railroad years before the events of the game, and who chose to stay and work for the organization rather than taking the new identity and fresh start she was offered. Glory's decision is one of those small-scale character choices that the game treats with enormous respect. The decision to remain in a dangerous position, doing dangerous work, because the work matters enough to justify the cost. She knows exactly what she is. She has had time to think about what it means, and she has decided that the answer to the question of what a synth is includes being exactly who she already is. The Brotherhood of Steel's long arc, from Mariposa to the Pridwin. We mentioned the Brotherhood of Steel earlier, in the context of Roger Maxon's rebellion against the FEV experiments at Mariposa. But the Brotherhood deserves its own sustained look, because across the full span of the Fallout series, it undergoes a transformation that is one of the most complete institutional character arcs in the games. Maxon's original Brotherhood was a moral institution. It was founded on a specific ethical position, that technology, and specifically military technology, had been allowed to develop outside any meaningful oversight, and that the results had been catastrophic. The Brotherhood's mission, in its founding form, was to collect and preserve dangerous technology so that it couldn't be weaponized by people who would use it to do what the pre-war government had done. The Knights and Paladins were guardians, not conquerors. Their secrecy was protective, not predatory. In the original Fallout and Fallout 2, the Brotherhood is already starting to show the early symptoms of what will eventually consume it. The tendency to define the preservation of technology in terms of its own institutional survival. The Brotherhood of the early games is guarded, but not hostile to outsiders who approach it correctly. It has relationships with the outside world. It has members who interact with surface communities and who understand the wasteland as something more than a source of technology to be retrieved and secured. By the time you reach the Brotherhood in Fallout 3, under Elder Lyons in the capital wasteland, the organization has split. Lyons' chapter has developed a humanitarian mission protecting the people of the capital wasteland from super mutants and other threats that has diverged significantly from the Brotherhood's traditional focus on technology preservation. This makes Lyons unusual among Brotherhood leaders and earns him both admiration and condemnation from other chapters. The chapter led by Elder Maxon in Fallout 4 represents the Brotherhood's most aggressive and most explicitly authoritarian form. Arthur Maxon, a young man who rose to leadership with exceptional speed and who commands the Pridwin, a dirigible warship with total authority, has absorbed the logic of the original Brotherhood's purpose and taken it to its extreme conclusion. Technology must be controlled. The Institute is producing technology that cannot be controlled. Therefore, the Institute must be destroyed. Synths are technology. Therefore, synths must be destroyed or controlled. The super mutants that continue to spread through the Commonwealth are the result of uncontrolled technological experimentation. Therefore, they must be destroyed. There is an internal consistency to Maxon's position that makes it impossible to simply dismiss as villain logic. He is applying the Brotherhood's founding principle, the one that Roger Maxon established at Mariposa when he executed the FEV scientists and sealed the vats, to the current situation in the Commonwealth. The original Maxon decided that some technology was too dangerous to allow to exist without oversight. Arthur Maxon has decided that the Institute's technology falls into that category, and he is not wrong. The Institute has been abducting and experimenting on Commonwealth residents for decades. Its synths have been used to infiltrate and destabilize communities. Its FEV experiments have been producing super mutants. By any standard, the Institute is doing exactly what the Brotherhood was founded to prevent. The problem is that the Brotherhood, in acquiring the institutional certainty needed to make those determinations, has also acquired the institutional blindness that prevents it from asking harder questions. Are synths really just technology? Is the solution to the Institute's abuses the complete destruction of everything it has produced? Is the Brotherhood's hierarchical, military, deeply undemocratic structure the appropriate form for an organization that is making life and death decisions on behalf of populations that had no say in the matter? These are the questions that the game is asking, and they don't have clean answers. The Brotherhood saves lives in Fallout 4. It also enforces compliance through the application of overwhelming force. It is, in that combination, recognizable as an institution with a history recognizable as something that was once better and has been gradually shaped by the pressures of survival and conflict into something more rigid and more dangerous than it was. Factions of the Mojave. The four-way war that shaped New Vegas. New Vegas presents four main factions competing for control of the Hoover Dam and the Mojave wasteland. And the depth of each faction's internal logic is one of the reasons the game remains so highly regarded decades after its release. The new California Republic is the closest thing to a functional government in the post-war American West. It started as an organized settlement around Shady Sands in California, the very location that the original Fallout game took place in, rebuilt and expanded across the generations into the capital of a democratic republic. By the time of New Vegas, the NCR has hundreds of thousands of citizens, elected leadership, a professional military, trade infrastructure, and all the accompanying problems of a large, bureaucratic, resource-dependent organization trying to expand faster than it can consolidate. The NCR's presence in the Mojave is imperial in the straightforward sense of the word. It wants the Hoover Dam because Hoover Dam means electricity, which means productive capacity, which means economic growth, which is the currency in which the NCR measures its health and progress. It has been fighting Caesar's Legion for control of the dam and the territory surrounding it for years by the time the courier arrives. And the fight has been grinding and costly, and has produced the specific kind of military culture that long-term territorial conflict always produces. A professional fighting force that has lost some of the idealism of its early history and retained primarily its institutional habits. The NCR isn't corrupt in the way that some post-apocalyptic governments are corrupt. Its corruption is more diffuse and more familiar. There are contractors who benefit from the continuation of the war. There are political pressures back in California that affect military decisions in the Mojave in ways that the people doing the fighting find maddening and inexplicable. There are veterans who have come back from the front lines with experiences that the civilian leadership back home genuinely doesn't understand and can't properly account for. All of this is immediately recognizable to anyone who has paid attention to how real-world governments conduct real-world wars, and the recognition is uncomfortable in exactly the way the game intends it to be. Caesar's Legion, led by Edward Sallow, under the name Caesar, is built on a different set of principles entirely. Sallow was a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, the scholarly, humanitarian organization that was dedicated to preserving pre-war knowledge and applying it to the benefit of wasteland communities who encountered a group of tribal warriors and made a decision about how to use what he knew. He was an expert in pre-war history and Roman military doctrine, and he used that knowledge to transform the tribal group he encountered into the beginning of a legionary force that he then used to conquer, systematically, the tribes of the American Southwest. Caesar's argument, which he will make to the courier at length if you give him the opportunity, is that the major pathology of the post-war world is tribalism, the proliferation of small, antagonistic, parochial groups that are incapable of building anything larger than themselves because the logic of tribal identity requires the construction of external enemies. His solution is forced assimilation. Conquer the tribes, strip them of their identities, integrate them into a unified structure, and create through violence a social cohesion that could not be achieved voluntarily. The unified force that emerges from this process is, in Caesar's argument, the only thing capable of providing the stability and scale that civilization requires. He is, in his own way, applying a specific lesson drawn from Roman history to the wasteland context. The Roman Republic didn't become the Roman Empire because the emperors were simply more powerful than the Senate. It became the empire because the Republic's institutional structures became incapable of managing the conflicts that arose from its own success. Caesar believes he is designing around that failure mode from the start, building an authoritarian structure explicitly, rather than arriving at one through the collapse of democratic institutions. The counter-argument which the game provides primarily through the character of Arcade Gannon and through the lives of the people you encounter in Legion-controlled territory is that a civilization built on slavery, the systematic erasure of cultural identity, is not civilization at all. It is occupation. The tribes that Caesar conquered didn't want to be assimilated. The women who serve as breeding stock in Legion territory didn't consent to that role. The slaves who build the Legion's infrastructure were not asked whether they found meaning in the work. The Legion functions. It is, by certain metrics, stable and efficient. But the stability is purchased through suffering, and the efficiency requires the maintenance of a system of brutality that poisons everything it touches. Mr. House, of course, has his own position on both. And Yes Man, the modified Securitron who becomes the player's partner in the independent New Vegas ending, represents the possibility which the game presents with characteristic ambiguity of building something that isn't any of the above, something whose form isn't determined yet. The Ghost People of Sierra Madre, when the experiment never ends. The Dead Money DLC for Fallout. New Vegas takes you to one of the most distinctly unusual environments in the entire series. The Sierra Madre is a pre-war luxury resort built in a remote mountain location, designed as the ultimate expression of pre-war affluence, a place where the wealthy could come to be treated with the kind of attention and care that only extreme money could buy. The resort was never opened. The bombs fell before it could hold its first guests. And the resort's owner, a man named Frederick Sinclair, who had built the Sierra Madre as a monument to his lost love, had installed a series of security and preservation measures that activated during the war and never stopped running. The cloud is the first thing you encounter when you approach the Sierra Madre. It is a blood-red chemical mist that has saturated the entire area around the resort, emerging from ventilation systems that Sinclair had designed for a different purpose, and that the war transformed into something toxic. The cloud kills slowly, eating at whatever organic material it contacts, and it has been doing this for 2 centuries. Everything in the Sierra Madre's vicinity has been soaked in it. The ground is saturated with it, and the Ghost People have been living in it for just as long. The Ghost People are one of the most disturbing creatures in the entire Fallout series, precisely because of what they used to be. They were the resort's security staff workers in environmental hazard suits, who were present during the war, and who were exposed to the cloud, and to something in the Sinclair security system's design that prevented them from ever leaving the area. The suits they wear are permanent now. They have grown into them over the generations, their bodies adapting to a chemistry that has replaced what they were with something else. They hunt in packs. They drag the dead away to unknown locations. They are, by any metric, no longer human, but they were, once, and the remnants of that are visible in their coordinated behavior and their apparent social structure. What the Dead Money DLC is specifically interested in is addiction and treasure. The Sierra Madre's vault contains enough caps and gold bars and pre-war goods to change the wasteland economy significantly, and the high structure of the DLC brings together a group of characters who have all been trapped by different forms of desire, by greed, by love, by ideological conviction, by the simple desire to survive. The Sierra Madre's holograms and systems are designed to reward visitors. They literally dispense pre-war food and chems. They are, in the most stripped-down expression of the casino metaphor, the slot machine that you can't stop playing because it sometimes pays out. The character of Elijah, the Brotherhood of Steel elder who engineered the heist and who turns out to have his own private agenda for the vault's contents, is one of the most interesting characters in New Vegas's extended universe. His obsession with the Sierra Madre's technology, specifically with the cloud and the holograms and the Ghost People suits, which he sees as tools for domination, is the product of a specific kind of institutional trauma. He was a leader of a Brotherhood chapter that was destroyed in combat, and the experience of watching his people die in a fight against an NCR force with superior numbers taught him a lesson about power that has been consuming him ever since. He wants technology that can't be matched. He wants a weapon so asymmetric that the question of numbers stops mattering. The lesson that the Sierra Madre teaches, and that the DLC embeds in its design with considerable craft, is that the thing you want most is usually not the thing that will save you. The gold in the vault is real. The technology is real. But carrying it out is nearly impossible, and the act of trying to carry it out has cost everyone involved more than the treasure is worth. The only rational exit from the Sierra Madre is to leave empty-handed, which the game makes into a formal choice, and which feels, when you make it, like its own kind of victory. The long, dark of lonesome road Ulysses, and the question of the courier. The final DLC of New Vegas, Lonesome Road, is a meditation on history and choice that feels almost unlike any other piece of content in the series. It brings the courier into direct confrontation with Ulysses, the character whose existence was hinted at throughout the base game, and whose absence, as the fact that he was supposed to deliver the platinum chip but declined, and left the job to the courier, is one of the unresolved threads that runs beneath everything that happens in New Vegas. Ulysses is a former member of the Legion who has become disillusioned with Caesar's project, and who has since traveled through the wastelands with a specific purpose: to understand the courier, to understand why history keeps making the same person the fulcrum of its pivotal moments. He has followed the courier's trail through the Divide, the blasted, ruined canyon that was once a thriving community, and he has been living in the ruins and waiting. The Divide is important to the Lonesome Road's mystery because of what happened to it. It was once a settlement, one of the rare stable communities that emerged in the post-war West, built in a natural canyon that provided protection from the worst of the environmental threats. The courier had a history there. They had carried packages through the Divide on multiple runs, and one of those packages had triggered a catastrophe that destroyed the community and created the perpetual storm system and the nuclear aftermath that defines the Divide's landscape in the game. The package was a detonator. The courier carried it without knowing what it was. The warheads buried in the Divide's soil pre-war nuclear weapons that had been sealed underground, and that the settlement had been built on top of activated when the signal from the detonator reached them. And the Divide was gone. Ulysses' argument, which he makes across the length of the DLC through holotapes and eventually in person, is that the courier is a figure of destruction, that wherever they go, things end. That the Divide is not an anomaly, but a pattern. The courier's trail through the wasteland is marked by the collapse of whatever they touched, and the events of New Vegas, the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. Whatever ending the courier chooses for the Mojave will be another expression of the same pattern. The courier's counterargument, which the player makes through the dialogue options available, is more complicated than a simple denial. The courier didn't know what was in the package. They were doing their job. The destruction of the Divide was real, but it was not chosen. And the question of whether unintended consequences create the same moral weight as intended ones is one that neither character can resolve with certainty. What Lonesome Road is really asking is the question of historical agency, whether individuals shape history or whether history shapes individuals. Ulysses has constructed a narrative in which the courier is a force of destruction, because that narrative makes the catastrophe of the Divide meaningful, makes it the result of a specific kind of person rather than an accident. The alternative is that the Divide was simply an accident, and accidents don't teach you anything about the world that you can use. The DLC's most striking visual is the flag. Throughout the Divide, Ulysses has been planting flags, the old American flag, the symbol of the nation that built the bombs that destroyed everything. He collects them as a kind of archaeology of belief, studying what people chose to die for, what symbols they carried into the fire. And, at the end of the DLC, the choice of whether to launch the nuclear missiles at the NCR, at the Legion, at both, or at neither, and the choice of what to do with Ulysses, becomes a question about what flags are worth dying for, and whether the person carrying them has the right to decide that for others. It is, as a piece of storytelling, remarkable. And it is also one of the deepest pieces of lore in the entire Fallout universe, because it is the only piece of content that directly addresses the question of what the courier is as a narrative entity, and what that means for the world they inhabit. The deep history of Ghoul's life and memory after the end. We have talked about the Great War and its aftermath, about the creatures it created and the institutions it destroyed and reformed. But we haven't spent much time on the most human consequence of 2 centuries of radiation, the ghouls. Ghouls are humans who were exposed to intense radiation and survived, transformed by the exposure into beings whose physical aging has effectively stopped. They are, in the Fallout universe, the closest thing to a record of the pre-war world that is still alive and speaking. The oldest ghouls, the ones who were already adults when the bombs fell, and who have survived the 2 centuries since, carry memories of the pre-war world that nobody else can access except from documents and records. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3, who was a professional courier before the war, and who has spent 2 centuries trying to find somewhere safe to exist in a world that increasingly defines his kind as less than human, is a portrait of what that kind of survival does to a person. He was a good man, probably. He was trying to help other ghouls find safety. And the game's Tenpenny Tower quest, which involves his attempt to secure housing in a secure luxury building for himself and his community, is one of the most morally complex quests in the capital wasteland. The quest has no good ending. Every path to resolution involves someone getting hurt. If you help the ghouls move into Tenpenny Tower, the human residents eventually leave or are killed, and then the ghouls turn on each other over the course of weeks in an escalation that you can only watch. The game is telling you something specific, that prejudice isn't solved by changing the physical location of the people it targets, and that a community built on exclusion doesn't stop practicing exclusion just because the people doing the excluding change. Ghouls in the Fallout universe are one of the series' most consistent vehicles for thinking about prejudice and memory. The ones who have retained their minds are, often, among the most experienced and capable people in the wasteland, carrying knowledge and skills that nobody else has because nobody else has been around as long. And yet, they are systematically treated as less than human by a significant portion of the wasteland's human population, including many factions whose own ancestors made exactly the same distinction about other groups of people for exactly the same kinds of reasons. The Cooper Howard storyline in the Fallout television series added a layer to the ghoul lore that was genuinely new. Cooper's transformation into a ghoul over the 2 centuries following the bombs, and specifically the question of what survives in a person through that kind of radical physical transformation, is one of the show's central preoccupations. Who is the ghoul? Is he Cooper Howard? Is he the person Cooper Howard became under specific pressures and in specific conditions? Is identity continuous across that kind of change, or does the transformation create a different person who simply carries the memories of the original? The show's answer, embodied in the performance and in the specific choices the character makes across both seasons, is something like, yes, he is Cooper Howard, and no, he is not Cooper Howard. And both of these things are true at the same time, and the tension between them is what makes him interesting. The Children of the Atom's full theology. We touched briefly on the Children of the Atom in the context of Far Harbor, but their theology deserves its own careful examination because it is one of the most thoroughly developed religious systems in the Fallout universe. The Children of the Atom emerged in the ruins of Megaton, the city built around an unexploded nuclear bomb in the center of the capital wasteland. The bomb still sits there when Fallout 3 begins, inert but present, a circle of water around it fed by a nearby spring that has been made mildly radioactive by leakage from the weapon's casing. And around this bomb, a community of worshippers has gathered and built a shrine. Their theology, articulated by their high priest Confessor Cromwell, holds that the nuclear explosion that ended the world was not a catastrophe. It was the first fission, the first splitting of the atom of the old world, and the radiation that followed was a blessing, a means of transformation. To be irradiated is to be touched by Adam, to be made into something more than the simple flesh that the pre-war world was trapped in. Ghouls are not the victims of nuclear fire. They are the children of Adam, the blessed ones, the people who have been most fully transformed. The imagery of fission, of splitting, of releasing what was contained, is used throughout the theology to describe everything from individual spiritual growth to the eventual destiny of the universe. The Children of the Atom believe that the universe is moving toward a total fission, a final splitting that will release all the energy that has been locked inside matter since the beginning of time, and that this event will be the ultimate fulfillment of Adam's will. They are, in other words, worshipping nuclear entropy as a cosmological process with a goal. This is a theology built from the specific vocabulary of the post-nuclear world, taking the physics of the apocalypse and finding meaning in it rather than despair. The people who joined the Children of the Atom were, in many cases, people who had been traumatized by the nuclear fire, and who found that the trauma became more bearable when it was reframed as divine intention. This is not unusual. Humans have always found ways to make meaning out of suffering, and the specific content of the suffering shapes the specific content of the meaning-making. What makes the Children of the Atom interesting from a lore perspective is the question of whether their theology is simply a coping mechanism or whether it points at something real in the Fallout universe's cosmology. The Grand Zealot in Far Harbor, Mother Isolde, has a level of radiation resistance that genuinely seems to exceed what biology should allow. The rituals of the children are described in various texts as producing effects that go beyond the placebo. The bomb in Megaton, when it does eventually go off if you choose that path in Fallout 3, creates an explosion that the immediate area survivors sometimes describe as having a quality to it that wasn't just physical. The game doesn't commit to the answer. It holds the possibility open that there is something real in the children's beliefs, and it holds equally open the possibility that they are simply a traumatized community that has built a beautiful and internally consistent delusion to get them through the centuries. The Lone Wanderer's Legacy. Fallout 3's unfinished business. The capital wasteland in Fallout 3 has its own set of unanswered questions that the game left deliberately open, and some of them connect to the broader Fallout universe in ways that later games have only partially addressed. Project Purity, the water purification project that James the Lone Wanderer's father dedicated his life to completing, is the central MacGuffin of Fallout 3's story. The idea is straightforward. Clean water for the wasteland. Purified water piped from the Jefferson Memorial's water treatment facilities to the wasteland's population. An end to the water scarcity that has made survival so difficult for so many people across the capital wasteland. The game's ending, across its different variants, addresses what happens to Project Purity after the events of Fallout 3. The Brotherhood of Steel activates the purifier and begins distributing clean water. The Enclave is destroyed. The Lone Wanderer either survives or dies, activating the purifier, depending on the ending. And then what? The Broken Steel add-on extends the game past that ending and gives you more time in the capital wasteland. But the question of what Project Purity actually means for the long-term political economy of the region is one that the game raises and doesn't fully answer. Clean water is infrastructure. Infrastructure creates dependencies. Who controls the purifier controls, in a very real sense, the survival of everyone downstream. The Brotherhood has that control now, and the Brotherhood's history suggests that they will use it in ways that reflect their institutional priorities. Whether that is good for the wasteland is, as always, a question that depends on what you think those priorities ought to be. The Oasis is one of the most striking locations in Fallout 3, a hidden valley containing the only genuine natural growth in the entire capital wasteland, produced by the transformation of Harold, one of the recurring characters from the early Fallout games. Harold was exposed to FEV in the original game and transformed into something between human and plant, with a tree growing from his head. Over the decades, the tree, which Harold calls Bob, with the resigned acceptance of a person who has been sharing his skull with a passenger for too long, grew and spread, and Harold himself became rooted to the earth of the valley, his body integrated with the roots, his consciousness still present and still speaking to the cultists who have formed a community around him. Harold's situation is one of the most philosophically interesting in the series. He is alive, conscious, and immobile. He has been living this way for long enough that the community around him has forgotten that he is not simply a god. He can still speak, still express preferences and emotions, and the specific dry humor of a person who has been alive too long and seen too much. And he has a very specific wish, which he will ask the player to either fulfill or deny. He wants to die. The question of whether to help Harold die or to help him spread is one of the moral puzzles that Fallout 3 handles with real delicacy. The cultists who worship him would be devastated by his death. The spread of his growth would help the wasteland, potentially. Harold's own preference is to stop. He is tired. He has been alive for centuries in conditions of profound immobility and wants the dignity of an ending. The game lets you give it to him, or withhold it. And the fact that it lets you give it to him, that it treats Harold's preference for death as a legitimate moral claim, as something worth honoring rather than overriding, is one of the small pieces of evidence that the series is, at its core, more interested in dignity than in sentiment. New Vegas's deepest secrets, what the Mojave doesn't say out loud. New Vegas is layered in ways that reward repeat playthroughs more than almost any other game in the series. The surface story, deliver the chip, find out who shot you, deal with the fallout, is compelling on its own terms. But the game has a second layer of concerns that are visible only if you're paying a specific kind of attention. The history of the Mojave before the NCR and the Legion arrived is one of those second-layer concerns. The tribes that Caesar assimilated, the Khans, the Fiends, the various communities scattered across the desert, had their own histories before they became pawns in the larger faction war, and the game preserves fragments of those histories in ways that most players never notice. The Great Khans, for instance, are not simply raiders. They are the surviving remnant of a tribe that traces its identity back through multiple disasters and reconstructions to an original community that was more complex and more internally varied than the raider stereotype suggests. The cons you encounter in New Vegas are people who have been specifically chosen by their circumstances to become the most dangerous and least domesticated expression of their culture, because the less dangerous and more domesticated people were killed or assimilated. What you see of the cons is the residue of several rounds of selection pressure for exactly the qualities that make them most difficult to work with. Honest Hearts. The DLC set in Zion National Park introduces the Burned Man, a figure who is Joshua Graham in the game's frame, the former legate of Caesar's Legion who was burned alive and thrown into the Grand Canyon for his failures in battle, and who somehow survived. Graham has become something between legend and specter in the wasteland, a figure so thoroughly defined by a specific catastrophic event that the event and the person have become almost inseparable. His specific situation, a man who survived what should have killed him, who was transformed by that survival into something very different from what he was before, who now lives in the Canyon Country as a defender of a small community of tribal people, is one of the most complete character studies in the series. Graham is religious in a way that none of the other major characters in New Vegas are. He is a Mormon convert who found in the framework of his faith a structure capable of holding the specific shape of what he has experienced. His violence is not separate from his faith. It is an expression of a theology that takes the reality of evil seriously, and that has conclusions about what the appropriate response to evil is. The tension between Graham's capacity for extraordinary violence and his genuine spiritual commitment is not resolved in the DLC, because it can't be resolved. It's a tension that has defined certain strains of religious thought throughout human history, and the game is smart enough to recognize that placing it in a character doesn't require that character to have an answer to it. The abandoned vaults. We never found cut content and lost stories. Every Fallout game has a substantial catalog of content that was designed and partially built, but never included in the final release. This cut content is a specific kind of mystery, because it reveals the intentions behind the final product, the stories that were planned and then lost, the characters who were designed but never completed, the locations that were built but then pruned from the map. New Vegas's cut content is particularly extensive, reflecting the game's compressed development timeline of roughly 18 months for a project of its scope. The most significant piece of cut content is probably the full Ulysses companion arc. Ulysses was originally designed as one of the game's companions, the companion who would have been the only pro-Legion option among the available followers. His presence in the finished game is entirely residual. References in dialogue, a character who is talked about extensively, but never appears until the Lonesome Road DLC. The Great Khan's questline, which was also substantially cut, would have involved a deeper integration with Khan culture and history, including an initiation ceremony involving unarmed combat. The vision of a courier who could join and be fully adopted by the Khans as a member of their community, rather than simply an ally, would have added a dimension to the tribal life of the Mojave that the finished game only gestures toward. The ability to explore Legion territory in full was another casualty of time constraints. The fort, Caesar's base, is accessible in the final game, but the larger Legion encampments that Joshua Sawyer, the game's lead designer, has described in interviews as planned but not completed, would have given the player a much more complete picture of what Legion society actually looked like from the inside. The Caesar the player encounters in New Vegas is interesting and complex, but he is presenting himself to an outsider. The social reality of the Legion, the daily life, the institutional culture, the experience of being a legionary rather than meeting one is largely invisible in the final game, and the cut content suggests it wasn't meant to be. What comes next? The shape of Fallout's unanswered future. As we approach the final stretches of this night, it's worth looking forward from the mysteries of the established games to the larger questions about where the Fallout universe is going and what mysteries it might yet answer. Fallout 5 has been announced, but is many years away from release. Bethesda's development priorities put it after The Elder Scrolls 6, which is itself still in early development. The TV show is continuing to explore the universe in ways that are generating new lore, and the choices that show makes about what questions to answer and how will inevitably shape the context in which the next game arrives. There are specific mysteries that the community has identified as the most likely candidates for resolution in future media. The identity of the mysterious stranger is one. The fate of the various protagonists, the courier especially, given the show's proximity to New Vegas's setting and timeline, is another. The broader question of what is happening in the rest of the world, in the parts of the planet that the bombs also touched, feels increasingly pressing as the show demonstrates the franchise's willingness to expand its geographic scope. The deeper questions, the ones about consciousness and identity, and what makes a person, and what makes a civilization worth preserving, are probably never going to be fully answered. They're not that kind of question. They're the kind that the stories keep asking, that get refined and deepened with each iteration, that acquire new dimensions every time someone picks them up and looks at them from a slightly different angle. That's what the best long-form storytelling does. It doesn't provide answers. It provides better and better questions. It trains you to look at difficult things without looking away. It gives you a language for things that are hard to talk about directly, wrapped in the specific vocabulary of a post-nuclear world, where the consequences of human decisions are visible in the landscape you walk through every day. The Wasteland teaches patience. It teaches the specific kind of patience that comes from learning to live with unresolved things, to hold the mystery without needing it to become something else, to walk through the ruins of what used to be something and find that the ruins are their own kind of meaning, that the stopped clocks and the faded posters and the holotapes full of voices that stopped speaking 2 centuries ago are not just artifacts of loss, but evidence of life, proof that something was here, that it mattered, that even in its ending, it left something that persisted. The Fallout universe endures because it is, at its core, interested in the same things that we are interested in when we look at the world we actually live in. It wants to know what we owe each other. It wants to know what institutions are for, and whether they can survive being the kind of things they were always going to become. It wants to know whether the worst things humans do are aberrations from human nature or expressions of it. And it has the intellectual honesty to not give you a comforting answer. War never changes, but the stories we tell about it do. And in the telling, something is preserved, something is carried forward into whatever comes next. That is the Fallout universe's deepest mystery and its deepest promise. End of expansion. Part 12. The unanswered questions mysteries the Wasteland will never fully solve. We have traveled a long distance through the Fallout universe in the hours we've spent together. We've been in the vaults, in the bunkers, in the offices, and the quarries, and the fog-wrapped shores. We have sat with the questions that the games raise and followed them as far as the available evidence leads. But there are questions that the games raise and deliberately leave unanswered. Places where the narrative stops and the silence takes over, and you are left with something that can't be resolved by careful reading or community theory crafting or developer interviews. These are the mysteries that the Wasteland keeps for itself. The alien question is one of them. Across the Fallout series, evidence of extraterrestrial contact accumulates with a consistency that is too persistent to be entirely decorative. In Fallout 3, the Mothership Zeta DLC takes the lone wanderer directly onto an alien spacecraft, encountering beings who have been abducting humans and animals for examination since before the bombs fell, possibly for much longer. The aliens of Mothership Zeta are hostile, or at least they behave hostilely. But their actual purpose, why they're here, what they want with the humans they've been collecting, how long they've been watching this particular world, is never explained. In Fallout 76, the Flatwoods monster is alien in nature, and the game's seasonal content regularly returns to alien themes. In Fallout New Vegas, one of the more obscure theories about the Great War holds that the bombs may have been triggered partly by alien observation or manipulation of the human weapon systems. The alien presence in the Fallout universe is treated as background radiation always there, contributing something to the overall environment, never fully brought into focus. It functions as a reminder that the events of the series, as large as they feel from the inside, are happening on the surface of a small planet, being observed by things that have different scales of concern. Then there is the question of what the Fallout world looks like beyond the maps. The games give us the American West Coast, the Mojave, the Capital Wasteland, Boston, and the Commonwealth. Appalachia. They reference events in the American Midwest and occasional hints of what has happened in other countries, but the broader post-war world remains almost entirely blank. What happened to Europe? The UK had its own Vault equivalent, the game Fallout. London. which is a massive fan project, explored this territory in unofficial form. What happened to China, the country that was on the other side of the nuclear exchange? Were there Chinese survivors? Did they maintain any institutional continuity? Do their descendants wander a wasteland that looks like the American one? Or did the same catastrophe produce entirely different shapes? The post-war human map is one of the biggest untold stories in the franchise. The America of the Fallout universe was a civilization that had extended its global influence through military and economic power in ways not entirely unlike the real United States. The collapse of that civilization didn't happen in isolation. It happened in the context of a global nuclear exchange that would have affected every part of the inhabited world. The silence about what those other parts of the world became is not a narrative absence, exactly. It feels more like a horizon, the edge of the known world, beyond which the map simply says, "Here there be something we haven't shown you yet." The memory lounges of the Fallout universe, particularly the Memory Den in Fallout 4, operated by a ghoul named Irma, who has been running the place long enough to have developed her own complex ethical relationship with the technology. She offers Ray's questions about the nature of consciousness and continuity that the game's never fully close. In the Memory Den, customers can experience the preserved memories of other people, can relive moments from lives that aren't theirs. The technology implies a specific model of what memory is, a dataset, a recording, something that can be transferred and experienced independently of the biological context that originally produced it. But the game also shows you what happens when this goes wrong, when the memories accessed are too painful, or when the technology creates dependencies in people who start to prefer the curated past to the difficult present. The haunting vision of the sole survivor, reliving their own pre-war memories in the den, seeing a version of the world before the bombs, populated by people who are gone, doing things that only matter because of how completely everything changed, is one of the most genuinely melancholy moments in a series that has a lot of melancholy to choose from. There is also the question of what happened to the protagonists after the game's end. The Vault Dweller, who destroyed the Master and the Mariposa military base, and who was then, in the original game, exiled from Vault 13 by an overseer who feared what their changed relationship with the surface world would do to the Vault's social stability. They walked out into the wastes, alone, and the game ends. The Chosen One, 2 decades later, who completed the events of Fallout 2, and whose fate is only gestured at in the epilogue slides. The Courier of New Vegas, who could end their story in any of 4 dramatically different configurations, depending on which faction they chose to support, and who then essentially passed out of documented history. The Lone Wanderer, the Sole Survivor. These people changed the world. Some of them changed it more than once. And then they disappeared into the silence that follows the story's climax. Whether they became the mysterious stranger, whether they lived out their years in the settlements they helped build, whether they found something worth calling a life in the wreckage of the old one, the games leave that to you. The final mystery of the Fallout universe is the one that underlies all the others, and it's not a mystery about who did what or why. It's a question the series has been asking since 1997. In the deep geometry of its design, in the bones of every setting and every faction and every broken system the player has to navigate. The question is, what is worth preserving? Not just the physical survival question, what materials and technologies and agricultural techniques you need to maintain a viable human population in a post-nuclear environment. That question has answers, however difficult they are to implement. The deeper question is about values, about what kind of civilization you build out of the wreckage, about whether the things that made pre-war America recognizable as civilization were worth keeping, and if so, which ones. The NCR tried to restore American democracy, and found that democracy in conditions of resource scarcity produces many of the same pathologies that it produced in the original. The Legion tried to build a post-war civilization around the virtue of hierarchy and military discipline, and found that a civilization built entirely on those values is one that most of the people living in it are trying to escape from. The Institute tried to advance human knowledge in conditions of radical isolation, and found that isolation from consequences produces a specific kind of ethical blindness. The Brotherhood of Steel tried to preserve technology in a vault of their own making, and found that institutions devoted primarily to self-preservation eventually start measuring everything else by the metric of how it serves the institution. Every faction in the Fallout universe is trying to answer the question of what's worth preserving. And every faction has found a partial answer that works for some things and fails at others. The genius of the series, the thing that makes it endure and compel, is that it doesn't give you the right answer. It gives you all the wrong answers and asks you to navigate between them. And in doing so, it is asking you the same question that the civilization that built the bombs was failing to ask itself. What are you actually building this for? The wasteland is quiet now. The fog has settled. Somewhere, the mysterious stranger is walking a highway that nobody else is using, moving towards something that even he might not be able to name. Somewhere in the deep levels of the Institute, a synth is sitting in the dark, turning over the question of what they are. Somewhere in a vault that has been sealed for 200 years, a community is living out the terms of an experiment that was designed by people who have been dead for generations, and they are doing it with the full human complexity that those designers were trying to study. And the study goes on. The stories are still being told. The mysteries are still waiting. The wasteland is patient. And if you're still here, still listening as the night goes on, then you already understand that the darkness isn't something to be afraid of. It is simply the medium through which the most important things become visible. You need the dark to see the stars. You need the quiet to hear what the silence is actually saying. In the Fallout universe, the silence says, "War never changes." But the people walking through the aftermath of war are always more complicated than that phrase allows. And that's the real mystery, isn't it? Not who dropped the first bomb, not what Qualtoth actually is, not whether synths are people, or what Mr. House was really trying to build in his tower in the desert. The real mystery is this: after everything, after the vaults and the FEV and the Enclave and the bombs and the 200 years of wreckage, after all of that, humans are still here, still building things, still fighting over what the things they build should be for, still making families and music and religions and gardens in the rubble, still walking out of whatever destroyed them and heading toward whatever comes next. That is the mystery that no amount of lore can fully explain. And it is, in its complicated and damaged and astonishing way, the most hopeful thing the wasteland has to offer. Thank you for spending these hours here. If this kind of slow, deep dive into the things you love is what you're looking for, there's plenty more where this came from. Leave a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm genuinely curious about who finds these videos in the small hours, and if you found this peaceful or useful or interesting, or even just something to fall asleep to, a subscription keeps these coming. Rest well. The wasteland will still be there tomorrow. End of script. Supplement: the lesser-known vaults and hidden horrors. Before we leave the vaults entirely, there are more stories that deserve to be told. Stories that never quite make it into the popular discourse around Vault-Tec's catalog of horrors, but which are no less disturbing for their relative obscurity. Vault 34 inches, the Mojave Wasteland, is one of these. The experiment there involved overpopulation and restricted access to armory resources. The vault was stocked with more residents than its life support systems could comfortably maintain, and the weapons cache, which was plentiful, because the vault had been provisioned for a larger and longer occupation than most, was kept locked, accessible only with the overseer's authorization. The result was a pressure cooker in which the means of violence were abundant but controlled, and the social stress of overcrowding made violence an increasingly attractive solution to resource conflicts. By the time you find Vault 34 inches New Vegas, it has flooded. The reactor is damaged. The survivors, the ones who are still alive and haven't been transformed by prolonged radiation exposure in the flooded sections, have fragmented into groups based on the weapon caches they control. The experiment didn't so much produce a result as it produced a process. The vault became a continuous demonstration of what happens to a community under resource stress when the social mechanisms for managing that stress are insufficient. The flooded lower levels of Vault 34 are some of the most atmospheric environments in the game. The water has a greenish glow from the radiation, and the current produces slow, dreamlike motion in the objects floating through the passages. It feels less like a military installation and more like an aquarium, and the creatures that move through those passages irradiated ghouls, mostly, but transformed in the specific way that long immersion in reactor-contaminated water produces reinforce the feeling that you are somewhere that has become its own kind of ecosystem, organized entirely by principles that Vault-Tec didn't intend. Vault 19 inches. New Vegas was the vault dedicated to studying paranoia. It was divided into two sections, red and blue, and the two populations were told that they were being watched by someone from the other section, that the other section had been given advantages, that the experiment required them to maintain competitive vigilance against the other group. The story never fully explains what the actual experimental design was, whether the populations were ever actually sabotaging each other, or whether the paranoia was entirely manufactured by the original setup. But by the time the vault was opened, the populations had developed the kind of mutual suspicion that makes subsequent cooperation essentially impossible. Vault 19 had a resident named Philip Lem, who became the leader of one of its surviving communities in the post-Vault period. Lem is encountered during the Fallout, New Vegas main questline, as the leader of a group of powder gangers, the prison laborers turned raiders, who have taken over the NCRCF outside Prim. He has carried the Vault's culture of paranoia into the outside world with him, and the powder gangers' behavior reflects a specific kind of institutional damage that Vault 19 spent years inflicting on its population. Vault 101 inches. Fallout 3 is interesting for a different reason from most Vault experiments. Its design was not about producing extreme stress or studying degradation. It was about isolation. Vault 101 was never supposed to open. The residents were told that it would remain sealed forever, that the outside world was too dangerous to ever return to, and the social order of the Vault was built around maintaining that belief. The experiment was studying whether a community, given the right institutional framework and enough separation from any alternative, could be maintained in permanent voluntary isolation indefinitely. The lone wanderer's escape from Vault 101, which begins the events of Fallout 3, is therefore not just a personal story. It is a breach in the experimental design, a moment when the sealed system became permeable, and the game's Vault sequences show you in detail what that breach means for the community left behind. Some residents are relieved, some are terrified. Some are angry with an intensity that can only be understood as the response of people whose entire conceptual framework for the world has been challenged. The Overseer, the lone wanderer's father's friend, a man who has been maintaining the Vault's cultural isolation with a combination of genuine belief and institutional self-interest, becomes antagonistic in a way that reflects the specific pathology of leadership that derives its authority from the maintenance of an illusion. The deep science of the Fallout universe. One of the things that gives the Fallout universe its distinctive texture is the specific kind of science that populates it. Not real science. Exactly. The physics and chemistry of the Fallout world have their own internal logic that diverges from ours in specific places, but a science that feels like science. That uses the vocabulary of research and experimentation and hypothesis. That produces recognizable institutional cultures around the pursuit of knowledge. The Big Mountain Research and Development Center, Big MT, is the most complete expression of pre-war science culture in the series. Accessible in the Old World Blues DLC for New Vegas, Big MT is a vast research facility built in a crater, populated by the preserved, disembodied brains of scientists who have been living there since before the bombs fell, and who have, in the centuries of isolation, drifted into various states of intellectual obsession that have detached them from any concern for the outside world. The think tank, the group of scientist brains who run the facility, is one of the most vividly drawn expressions of a specific intellectual type. The researcher who has become so absorbed in their work that they have lost the context that gives the work meaning. They have been conducting experiments on each other and on the wasteland around them for 2 centuries. They have forgotten that the things they study have lives outside the parameters of the study. They have, in a specific and recognizable way, become the kind of scientists that the pre-war world's institutional structures were designed to produce. People who are very good at answering questions, and who have stopped asking whether those questions should be answered. The Courier's encounter with the think tank is in some ways the most directly satirical piece of writing in New Vegas. The scientists' cheerful incomprehension of the human cost of their work, their inability to understand why the person whose brain, heart, and spine they removed might find that removal worth remarking on, is recognizable as a specific failure mode of expertise. The tendency to mistake technical proficiency for wisdom, to assume that being very good at one thing qualifies you to make decisions about everything. The Securitron technology that Mr. House developed for the Mojave is another expression of Big MT's legacy. Technically extraordinary, strategically powerful, and deployed without much consideration for the lives of the people who aren't Securitrons. House himself is, in some ways, the most complete avatar of the Big MT intellectual type. Brilliant, focused, capable of extraordinary sustained effort, and fundamentally limited by the assumption that his assessment of the situation is more correct than anyone else's assessment of the situation could possibly be. The FEV research that we've discussed in detail is the pre-war scientific project whose consequences have been most directly destructive. But it is worth noting that the FEV researchers at Vault-Tec and Mariposa were, in their own institutional context, doing exactly what researchers at a defense contractor in a nation at war are supposed to do. They were pursuing a research agenda that had been approved and funded by the relevant authorities. They were following procedures. The moral failure at Mariposa was not the failure of individual researchers who were secretly evil. It was the failure of an institutional system that had normalized the use of unconsenting human subjects in research by placing that normalization behind enough layers of classification and distance, that the people doing the actual research could maintain a functional separation from the consequences. Roger Maxon's rebellion at Mariposa was, in that context, the moment when someone inside the system refused to maintain that separation. When someone insisted on looking directly at what was being done, rather than at the sanitized version of it that the institutional language provided. The Brotherhood of Steel, at its founding moment, was a group of people who chose clarity over comfort. That they subsequently built their own institutional structures that eventually produced their own blind spots is not a contradiction of that founding. It is simply what institutions do. The children of the old world pre-war survivors and living memories. The ghouls we discussed earlier represent one class of people who bridge the gap between the pre-war world and the present. But the Fallout universe has other kinds of bridges, people, and minds and objects that carry something of what the old world was into the world that came after. Talon Company's connection to pre-war military contracting is one of those bridges. The Enclave's institutional memory is another. And then there are the individual cases, the specific people and minds whose survival across the decades has given them a relationship with history that no one else has. Dean Domino, encountered in Dead Money, is a pre-war entertainer, a singer and performer who was ghoulified by the bombs and who has spent 2 centuries in the Sierra Madre, unable to leave, watching the resort that should have been his greatest triumph remain perpetually just out of reach. His personality is defined by the specific damage of someone who has been nursing a grievance for 200 years. He has had 2 centuries to refine the story of how he was wronged, to polish the resentment into something that functions as an identity rather than an emotion. His bitterness is real, and the game treats it seriously rather than dismissing it as a character flaw. What would 2 centuries of frustrated ambition feel like? What does sustained imprisonment do to the specific qualities of a person over that kind of time frame? Domino is an answer to that question, and it's not a comforting one. He has not been made wise by his long life. He has been made precise in his resentments and his calculations and his entirely accurate assessment of everyone's weaknesses. Wisdom requires something other than intelligence and experience. It requires, perhaps, a capacity for acceptance that 200 years of resentment has specifically not produced in Domino. Christine Royce, the Brotherhood scribe also encountered in Dead Money, has a different kind of pre-war connection. She was operating closer to the present in terms of lived experience, but her situation mute, scarred, sealed in an auto-dock that partially repaired damage she's been carrying for years, is a portrait of a person who has been shaped by circumstances into something that can no longer easily communicate what's happening inside them. Her storyline, which you piece together from notes and from her own limited communications, is one of the quietest and most affecting in the DLC. The pre-war ghoul teachers and scholars that you encounter in various games, the ghouls who remember the old world well enough to offer specific knowledge that nobody else can provide, are among the most poignant figures in the franchise. They carry memories that the wasteland cannot otherwise access, that exist nowhere in the documentary record. that are simply the lived experience of people who were present and survived, and the knowledge that when they die, that experience dies with them, that there is no mechanism for preserving the specific quality of remembering rather than knowing, gives the ghouls a relationship with mortality that is genuinely unusual. They are not afraid of dying in the way that shorter-lived humans might be, but they are aware, in a way that shorter-lived humans aren't, of exactly what death will cost. The maps we never see. The wider wasteland world. The Fallout universe is confined, in terms of playable content, to specific regions of the American continent, but the lore reaches beyond those regions in ways that are consistently provocative and consistently incomplete. China, as we discussed in the context of the Great War, remains almost entirely a blank. The game's version of China was a communist state in the mid-20th century. Style, or rather, a version of that style filtered through the specific alternate history lens of the Fallout universe that was locked in an existential conflict with America over the remaining resources of a depleted planet. The Chinese forces in Operation Anchorage, the DLC for Fallout 3, are presented almost entirely as enemies without interiority. They exist to be defeated in a simulation of a battle that the US won. Their institutional culture, their motivations, their experience of the war and its aftermath, none of this is addressed. The fan project, Fallout London, released in 2024, explored the British post-war wasteland with impressive thoroughness and with a distinct cultural voice that demonstrated how different the post-war world might look in a different cultural context. It's not official canon, but it's an argument for the proposition that the Fallout universe's stories don't all need to be American stories, that the specific textures of different cultural contexts would produce different kinds of post-apocalyptic societies, with different kinds of problems and different kinds of wisdom. There are hints throughout the series of what happened in Europe. Fallout 3's Point Lookout has a European trader character. New Vegas references pre-war European culture in several locations. Fallout 4's Codex entries sometimes reference the global scope of the nuclear exchange, but the picture is deliberately fragmentary, and the silence of the unshown world is, in its way, one of the most evocative things about the series. The suggestion is that the American stories we're being told are not universal, that somewhere beyond the map, things are different. That the specific pathologies of American culture, the corporate dominance, the specific character of the propaganda, the particular ways in which institutional power organized itself, and the particular kinds of resistance it generated, produced a specific kind of wasteland that doesn't necessarily characterize everywhere. That other places, hit by the same bombs, might have produced different survivals. Whether Fallout 5 or some other future entry will ever take us to those other places is one of the genuinely interesting open questions in the franchise's development. The world is large. The wasteland extends in all directions, and the stories that could be told about what lies beyond the places we've already been to are numerous enough to sustain a very long project. Fallout 76's Reclaimed Wasteland, What Appalachia Teaches. Fallout 76 occupies an unusual position in the franchise's lore because its setting in time, 2102, 25 years after the bombs fell, means that it takes place earlier than any other mainline game except the original Fallout 1 and 2, which are set in 2161 and 2241 respectively. The Appalachian wasteland of 2102 is raw in a way that the later game's locations aren't. The buildings haven't been picked over as thoroughly. The institutional memory of the pre-war world is much more present. The ghouls are younger. Some of the survivors are still in their first generation post-war. The evidence of what the world was is less faded. And crucially, there are no other surviving humans at the start of the game. The emptiness of Appalachia, when the player first emerges from Vault 76 on Reclamation Day, 2102, is one of the game's most distinctive design choices. There are monsters. There are robot caretakers following their programming in a world that no longer has the people they were designed to serve. There are records and terminals and notes from people who are gone, but there are no human survivors walking the wasteland. No settlements, no factions established in the way that later games have them. The reasons for this emptiness are themselves a mystery, one that the game's quests gradually unfold. An event called the Scorched Plague has killed most of the surface survivors. The plague was a vector created by a species of creatures called the Scorched, which were themselves the result of a specific interaction between the surviving humanoid population and a fungal organism that the bombs released from the subsurface geology. The plague is not a metaphor. It is a specific ecological mechanism, a biological cascade set off by the nuclear event that the wasteland's remaining inhabitants had to find ways to survive and eventually address. The organization that was trying to address it, the Free States, had established fortified settlements and was working on a vaccine before the plague overcame them. The records they left behind in their bunkers and their labs, and on the personal terminals of people who knew they were dying, are among the most fully realized pieces of ambient storytelling in the game. They are portraits of people who were competent and dedicated and trying very hard to solve a problem that was too large for the resources they had available. The Fallout 76 lore around the Scorched Plague also deepens the game's engagement with the specific geography of Appalachia, the pre-war industrial history of West Virginia, the coal mining, the chemical industry. The military research that was conducted in the mountains is directly implicated in the post-war ecology. The chemicals that industry introduced into the soil and water interacted with the radiation in specific ways. The mining infrastructure created pathways for contamination to move through the subsurface geology. The landscape is carrying the consequences of specific industrial decisions made by specific companies in specific decades, and the post-war inhabitants are paying the costs of those decisions in ways they can trace, if they look carefully enough, all the way back to the corporate decisions of the pre-war period, which is, of course, exactly what the Fallout universe always says. The wasteland is the consequence of specific decisions made by specific people in specific institutional contexts. The ecology of Appalachia's post-war world is the ecology of Appalachia's pre-war industrial economy, with 2 centuries of radiation on top of it. Understanding what the wasteland is requires understanding what was here before the bombs, and that requires a kind of historical attention that the series consistently rewards. Final words: the wasteland at rest. It is late now, or early, the kind of time when the line between night and morning is unclear, and the darkness has gone quiet. The world outside is doing whatever it does in the small hours, and you are here, somewhere, listening to stories about a world that never was. There is something that happens in the late hours, when you've been spending time with something you love. The defenses come down a little. The part of the mind that is always on alert, always assessing and comparing and measuring, softens its grip. And what's left is something more direct, a relationship with the story that isn't mediated by criticism or analysis, that is simply presence. The Fallout universe rewards that kind of presence. It rewards the willingness to slow down and look at the things it's built, to follow the threads it lays out with patience rather than urgency, to sit with the mysteries rather than demanding that they resolve. The wasteland is full of things that don't resolve. That's not a failure of the storytelling. It's a feature of it. The real mysteries, the ones that pull you back to these games year after year, decade after decade, aren't the plot mysteries. They're not about who dropped the first bomb, or what Ugg-Qualtoth actually is, or whether the mysterious stranger is a synth or a legend. Those are the visible faces of the questions. The actual questions, the ones underneath, are about what we owe each other and what it costs to keep asking that question in a world that has given you every reason to stop. The wasteland is patient. It has been patient for 200 years, waiting for the people walking through it to look up from their survival calculations and notice that they are living in the consequences of a civilization's failure to ask itself the right questions. And every player who picks up a controller and walks into the ruins is, in some small way, asking those questions, turning them over, thinking about what they mean. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, precisely what the medium is for. Thank you for being here, for all the hours, for the quiet company. If this journey through the wasteland's mysteries has been the kind of thing you return to if you find yourself wanting more slow, deep explorations of the stories that matter to you, then leave a comment below. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is there. Tell me what you're doing and whether you're still awake. There's something about knowing where in the world these words land. And if you're not already subscribed, this is the kind of content that lives here. Long, patient, interested in the things that deserve more than a quick take. The subscribe button keeps these coming, and it means something to have you along for the journey. Rest well. The wasteland will still be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. It always is. The followers of the apocalypse, keepers of knowledge in a world that forgot. There is a faction in the Fallout universe that doesn't get nearly as much attention as the Brotherhood or the NCR or Caesar's Legion, but whose values and methods and history are, in some ways, the most interesting of all. The Followers of the Apocalypse are a humanitarian organization, one of the very few in the entire series dedicated to the preservation and free distribution of pre-war knowledge, to the provision of medical care in wasteland communities, and to the general proposition that the survivors of the nuclear fire deserve something more than to be used as resources by whatever institution is currently in charge of their region. The Followers founded in the ruins of the Los Angeles Public Library, a detail that is either deliberate symbolism or the kind of coincidence that the Fallout universe produces in abundance, and have been operating in the based California wasteland since the early post-war period. They have doctors and researchers and historians and archaeologists. They dig through the ruins of the old world for knowledge that might be useful to the new one. They provide medical care in communities that have no other access to it. They maintain archives. They educate. In a universe full of factions that want to control the post-war world, the Followers of the Apocalypse are the faction that wants to help it understand itself, which makes them, of course, deeply unpopular with most of the other factions. The NCR has an uneasy relationship with the Followers because the Followers represent an institutional form that doesn't fit neatly into the NCR's governance model. They provide services that the NCR wants to provide, but can't always afford to. And they do so without acknowledging the NCR's authority over the territories they operate in. The Brotherhood of Steel views the Followers with the specific suspicion of an institution dedicated to controlling knowledge toward a faction dedicated to distributing it. And Caesar's Legion views the Followers as a direct threat, which is why Caesar had several follower camps destroyed before the events of New Vegas. Arcade Gannon, the Followers of the Apocalypse companion in New Vegas, is the most complete expression of what the organization produces in its best members. A person with technical expertise, genuine humanitarian commitment, and a specific kind of political sophistication that comes from working in the wasteland for years, and understanding exactly how complicated the relationship between good intentions and good outcomes can be. Gannon has a personal history that he keeps private, one that connects him to the Enclave in a way he has spent years trying to escape. And the process of learning that history and understanding his relationship to it is one of New Vegas's most thoughtful character quests. His ultimate choice, in the DLCs and the main game's various endings, is whether to step forward and lead, or to continue in the background support role that the Followers' philosophy generally suggests. The game treats the tension between those positions with real care. The question of whether a person with his abilities has an obligation to use them in a more direct way, or whether the specific kind of support and care that he offers is its own form of leadership, is not resolved. It's a question the character lives with, which is probably the most honest way to handle it. The Followers also appear in Fallout 76, in slightly different form, as the Raiders' medic faction, the Free States, which is not quite the same organization, but shares enough of its DNA that the connection is meaningful. And their absence from Fallout 3 and 4 is notable precisely because of what those games choose to center instead: the Brotherhood, the Institute, the Minutemen. The choice to have a faction dedicated to free distribution of knowledge in the margins rather than the center of the narrative is itself a kind of commentary on what the post-war world prioritizes: Deathclaws and the forgotten history of a perfect predator. There is a creature in the Fallout universe that is not often analyzed for its lore implications, but that has one of the more interesting backstories in the series. The Deathclaw is ubiquitous in the wasteland, one of the first creatures the player learns to fear, a consistent source of lethal encounters across every game in the series, and a persistent symbol of the dangerous ecological transformation that nuclear fire produced in North America. But Deathclaws weren't created by the bombs. They were engineered. Before the war, Deathclaws were Jackson's chameleons, a species of Central American lizard. The pre-war military, in a program that parallels the FEV experiments in its application of cutting-edge biology to the goal of creating better weapons, began modifying these lizards using a combination of FEV exposure and selective gene splicing. The goal was to produce a pack hunter that could be deployed in combat situations, that was smart enough to follow tactical direction, but aggressive enough to be effective in open engagement. The result exceeded the specifications on every axis. The FEV modified the chameleons in ways that the researchers hadn't entirely predicted, and the creatures that emerged from the program were larger, faster, and considerably more intelligent than the original design called for. Their hide hardened. Their claws grew to dimensions that made the name obvious. And the intelligence that the program had designed for tactility became, in the absence of the handlers who had been supposed to direct it, something closer to genuine sapience in some bloodlines. The death claws you encounter in the later games, particularly in Fallout 2 and New Vegas, where some deathclaw populations have developed genuine communication and community structures, are the products of that program, plus 2 centuries of evolutionary pressure in a radiation-saturated environment. They are not simply apex predators. They are former military assets that outlasted the military that made them, and that have, in the time since, developed into something that the military's designers would have found deeply unsettling. The Deathclaw mother and her eggs, which you can encounter in multiple games, represent a species that has organized its reproductive and social behavior around the specific pressures of the wasteland. They are territorial and aggressive because those are the traits that survived. They are capable of sophistication in their pack behavior because the bloodlines that didn't develop it were eaten by everything else in the wasteland. They are, in the precise biological sense, successful, and their success is the direct result of what was done to their ancestors in a government laboratory before the bombs fell. There is a specific kind of consequence at work in the Deathclaw story. The military wanted a weapon. They created a predator. The predator outlasted the war that justified its creation and became part of the ecology of everything that came after. The wasteland is full of these inheritances, these artifacts of pre-war decision-making that took on their own existence in the absence of the institutions that created them, and became something that those institutions never intended and could not have controlled. The Enclave's final form, what the government became. We've talked about the Enclave as an organization through its appearances in Fallout 2 and Fallout 3. But the full picture of the Enclave's institutional history, assembled from fragments across the games and the TV show, suggests something more complicated than either of those portrayals fully captures. The Enclave that appears in Fallout 2 is an organization that has been in isolation for 2 centuries and has developed, in that isolation, a specific kind of institutional psychosis. The logic that justified its founding, that the U.S. government needed a continuity structure to survive a nuclear attack and rebuild American civilization has, in the absence of any actual rebuilding, curdled into a justification for something else entirely. The people who are now the Enclave are not the original government officials who went into the bunkers in 2077. They are their descendants, born into a closed society with a very specific ideology about who they are and what the people outside their walls are. The purity doctrine, the idea that the Enclave represents genetically pure humanity and that the wasteland's population has been irreversibly contaminated by radiation, is not an original policy position. It emerged over the generations as the organization needed a way to justify its continued separation from the people it was supposed to eventually govern. If you tell yourself that the survivors are not fully human, you don't have to engage with the moral questions that arise from watching them suffer in the world you were supposed to help rebuild. The purity doctrine is the Enclave's way of not having to ask itself those questions. The Colonel Autumn Strand in Fallout 3 is interesting because it represents a faction within the Enclave that had begun to question the purity doctrine not on moral grounds, necessarily, but on practical ones. Eden's plan to poison the water supply would kill almost everyone who survived the radiation. Autumn's disagreement with Eden is not that the plan is wrong in principle, but that it leaves no population to govern, which makes it strategically useless from the perspective of rebuilding American civilization. It's a pragmatic objection rather than a moral one, but the game uses the distinction carefully. The people who object to atrocity only on pragmatic grounds are not heroes, but they are also not the same as the people who don't object at all. The Enclave's ultimate failure in every game is the failure of institutions that have too thoroughly insulated themselves from the feedback of the people they were supposed to serve. They are the extreme case of what every major faction in the Fallout universe partially represents. A group of people who decided that their assessment of what humanity needed was correct, and acted on that assessment without meaningful input from the humans in question. The result is always some form of catastrophe, maybe not as dramatic as the original Great War, but recognizable as belonging to the same category of disaster. The question of memory, what the holotapes tell us. Across every game in the Fallout series, the dominant form of ambient storytelling is the holotape. The pre-war cassette tapes that can be found in drawers and on bodies, and in the corners of ruined offices and homes. The recorded messages, the personal diaries, the work notes, and the love letters, and the final words of people who knew or didn't know that there wasn't going to be another day. The holotape as a narrative device does something that direct storytelling can't quite achieve. It makes the absence visible. When you find a holotape in a ruined bedroom, the message on it was recorded by someone who was standing in that bedroom when it was intact, who was alive and present and speaking into a recorder because the act of recording felt meaningful, who did not know or could not accept that the world they were recording in was about to end. There is a specific quality to the personal holotapes, not the corporate ones, not the military briefings, but the private recordings that makes them among the most affecting pieces of writing in the series. The woman recording a birthday message for her husband who is away on deployment. The researcher logging his thoughts on an experiment that will never be completed. The child recording a diary entry about something that matters to a child and that has been preserved for 2 centuries in a box in a ruined house. These recordings are the primary argument that the Fallout universe makes for the importance of memory, for the importance of documentation and record keeping, for the importance of paying attention to the small things rather than only the large ones. The large things, the bombs, the factions, the power struggles, are documented in the official records. The small things, the human things, the things that make the people who built the bombs recognizable as people, survive only in the personal records, only in the holotapes. The sole survivor's personal history, expressed through the pre-war home in Sanctuary Hills that you can explore before the bombs fall in Fallout 4's opening sequence, is the most intimate version of this. Nate and Nora's home is a portrait of a specific life, with specific objects and specific relationships and specific evidence of the human scale of the loss. The baby toys in Sean's room, the correspondence on the kitchen counter, the television showing news of the escalating crisis, and the specific way that the family is responding to it, the mixture of denial and preparation and ordinary life continuing, because ordinary life is what there is until it isn't. The bombs fall. The cryogenic pods close. 200 years pass. And when you wake up, all of that is still there, preserved in ice, exactly as it was. The toys are still in the baby's room. The television is still on, or would be if the power hadn't failed. The house is still standing, damaged but recognizable. The wasteland is built on these frozen moments, these preserved last days. And every holotape you find is another one, a moment that someone thought was worth recording, that the destruction and the 2 centuries and the scavengers and the radiation somehow failed to erase entirely. There is something about that persistence that is genuinely moving, in the way that the best things about the Fallout universe are moving. Not sentimental, the series is almost never sentimental, but honest. Honest about what it costs to lose everything, and honest about what survives even so.